Hello, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on this very weird snowy day. They said it was supposed to just be like -1 to a high of 2, so I decided to wear not my winter gear, and I come outside and I'm like, what is happening? But anyway, thank you all so much for joining us this morning and for trudging through the snow. My name is Nikia Lifoon. I'm a PhD candidate at the Dalhousie School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. I'm also the Vice President of the Black Health Alliance, which is a non-for-profit organization that aims to help enhance the health and well-being of African, Caribbean, and Black populations in Toronto. So on behalf of Elsie Amako, who's the planner of today's event, the Racialized Maternal Health Conference, as well as the volunteers, I'd like to welcome you today. So before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that the land in which we're on, the sacred land in which the BMO Education Conference Center operates, has been the site of human activity for the past 15,000 years. This land is a territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory, Miigwech. So the first individual that will come up today and provide us with welcome and opening remarks is Dr. Fatima Jackson Best. Dr. Best is a doctoral graduate of my school, the Dalhousie School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. Her dissertation explored maternal depression in Barbados, and she is currently involved in mental health and HIV/AIDS research, consultancy work in Canada and the Caribbean. I'd like you all to give her a warm welcome. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you. I just came from the Caribbean, so when people say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, people generally very enthusiastically reply. Obviously, it's a lot better weather, so people are a little bit in a better mood. So thank you, Nikia, for the wonderful introduction. So good morning to you all. As Nikia mentioned, my name is Fatima Jackson Best, and I'm a healthcare researcher, and I also like to call myself a scholar activist. So last fall, while I was consulting on a research project in Trinidad and Tobago, I received an email from Elsie Amako about a conference that she was planning, which would be focused on the maternal health of racialized women. And she asked if I would like to be involved. So if any of you have ever been involved in consulting work, I'm sure that you get tons of emails from clients, from supervisors, from all types of people, but these are the kinds of emails that you look forward to opening. And I was so excited to know that this kind of event was being planned and in my hometown, Toronto, no less. So I jumped at the opportunity to be part of what I was sure would be an informative and necessary conference. One of the biggest reasons that I felt so connected to the theme and purpose of this conference is because I'm a Black woman with roots in the Caribbean. My father and his family are from a small island that some of you may have heard of called Barbados. And in 2010, when I decided that I wanted my dissertation research to focus on Black women's experiences of self-reported postpartum depression and the baby blues, I had a feeling that the island of my father and my grandmother's birth would be an ideal place to do this work in. As it turned out, Barbados is the perfect location for many things, and I ended up living and working on the island for about 6 years, and I conducted my dissertation research there at the time. So over the last few weeks, as I've been preparing to give these opening welcoming remarks for the conference, I couldn't help but to think back to my time in Barbados and my PhD research and the journey that it took me on. And if it's okay with you all, this morning I want to share a story from the experience which came to mind and which also became an important part of my research findings. So while I was conducting my one-on-one interviews with women in Barbados and listening to their experiences with postpartum depression and the baby blues, I began to notice a pattern. All of the women in my project had received public maternal health care from the community health centers, which are called polyclinics on the island. Of course, women getting regular antenatal checkups and interacting with healthcare providers who would see them through their pregnancies to the postpartum stage is great news. It showed me that Barbados has a maternal healthcare system that these women access with relative ease. Women explained to me that while they were pregnant and after giving birth, during their polyclinic visits, nurses and doctors counseled them on topics like breastfeeding techniques, how to care for their new babies, and what forms of contraceptives would be available to them. However, as I continued my interviews, I also realized that when I asked women if the nurses and doctors that they saw in the polyclinics during their pregnancies and after giving birth had ever explained what postpartum depression and the baby blues were, nearly every single woman in my research project said that they had not received information from those sources. Every single woman except for one. Let's call her Robin. So what set Robin apart from the others was that she hired a private midwife early on during her pregnancy. So when I heard this, being a researcher, my ears immediately perked up. When I asked Robin what that midwife did to educate her about maternal mental health, she told me that her midwife explained to her and her husband what postpartum depression and the baby blues were, their symptoms, and ways to seek help. She also told her that postpartum depression and the baby blues are experienced by many women, including women in Barbados and across the Caribbean, and that having symptoms of either condition did not make her a bad mother. This was one of the most exciting pieces of information that I gathered from my interview with Robin. And what added to that excitement was that I actually knew the midwife that she was speaking about, because Barbados is a very, very small place. The midwife is a Black woman who was born in the UK, and she has both Bayesian and Guyanese backgrounds. She moved to Barbados after completing her training in the UK to offer women high-quality midwifery care several years before I arrived on the island. She's also the first and only person to open a completely independent natural birthing center on the island, which operated outside of the polyclinics and the public hospital where most women on the island give birth. And she also faced tremendous pushback from the government on that, but that's a different story for a different conference. Although the birthing center is no longer open today in Barbados, her private midwifery practice continues, and it focuses on providing top quality woman and family-centered care that aims to empower and inform her clients. To me, this midwife is a hero, and to Robin, she was nothing short of a savior, because the information that she provided her with enabled her to recognize her own symptoms of postpartum depression. Recognizing those early on led Robin to seek support from her husband and her network of family and friends, and to seek help from her healthcare providers. The relationship that she created with her midwife empowered her, and it led her to participate in my research project. So it was a beautiful full circle moment. Since that interview, I think about Robin and her midwife quite a bit, because the relationship that they built illustrates how important these healthcare providers are to pregnant women and new mothers. Midwives are important not only because they help women give birth safely, but also because they are critical to the work of creating supportive and empowering environments for women. I regularly imagine how revolutionized maternal health care would be in Barbados if this kind of midwifery support were available to every woman who wanted it, regardless of her income or class background. So while Robin, the woman in my study, had the financial means to hire a private midwife, there are many more women in Barbados who cannot afford something like this. In fact, most of the women in my research project were struggling to pay for basic necessities like rent, nutritious food, and diapers for their babies. A private midwife who charges by the hour was not in the realm of possibility for many of those women. I also imagine what kinds of changes we would see if midwives like Robin's had more prominent roles at decision-making tables for maternal health policy and programming on the island. And of course, I cannot help but to think about this story within the context of Barbados' complicated history, which is an island that is over 90% Black, but is still deeply affected by its not-so-distant colonial past. And it's also notorious for its deep class and racial divisions. We often think about the ills of colonialism, but we don't always speak of its direct impacts on women and mothers. In Barbados and in many islands across the Caribbean, midwives had historically been integral parts of the birthing process. Midwives assisted in the births of enslaved Black women, and after the period of enslavement, they worked with women from different backgrounds to deliver babies safely. But over time, midwifery was marginalized by the state, which also created restrictions on their practice. Later on, they were integrated back into the healthcare system as the occupation became professionalized. In Barbados now, it isn't uncommon to see government-appointed midwives working at the public hospital and in those polyclinics. And I remember when I was recruiting women to my study in those spaces, I met many midwives that were genuinely excited about my research, and some who even encouraged women to participate in my project. However, when I would ask them if they ever spoke to the women attending the antenatal and maternal clinics, if they had ever provided information on those conditions, the baby blues and postpartum depression, many of them admitted that they hadn't, including a young midwife working in a polyclinic who admitted to me that she'd experienced postpartum depression recently, but that hadn't led her to ask the new mothers in her care if they were also experiencing symptoms of the condition. So I'm telling you all this morning to emphasize the fact that what this midwife did for Robin, the woman in my research project, was revolutionary. It changed the course of her postpartum experience, and it aided in her overall mental well-being. And what she did is revolutionary in any setting, whether that's in Barbados or right here in Toronto. I also tell you this because when it comes to the maternal health of Black women and racialized women, we are at a critical point. We know that many of the health issues experienced by pregnant women and new mothers are influenced by a range of factors, like income, education, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and religion. I'm sure that many of us in this room were alarmed hearing US-based research that made the rounds at the end of 2017 and confirmed that Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy or childbirth-related complications in comparison to white women. Right here in Canada, some First Nations groups have infant mortality rates that are up to 4 times the national average. And in my own Caribbean-focused research, I discovered that rates of postpartum depression and the baby blues were actually higher in the region in comparison to existing rates in North America. The maternal health of racialized women is a global concern, and I cannot overemphasize that enough to you all today, and I expect that you all know this, which brought you here today. However, in the face of these international and local examples of racialized maternal health, this conference offers us tremendous hope and opportunity. The very act of us all coming here today to this space and claiming it to discuss, learn, and strategize about this important topic is one manifestation of hope and opportunity. Today, each of us has a chance to do some self-reflection, and I encourage each of us to take a moment to reevaluate our motivation, investment, and work with racialized women's maternal health. I also know that it can be easy to get caught up in the networking experiences at a conference or to get preoccupied with competing obligations that may take up mental space, which may make it difficult to truly be present and reap the benefits of an event like this. But we cannot forget that each of us were led to this room, in this city, in this country today for a reason. So to all of the midwives, the midwifery students, birth doulas, postpartum doulas, nurses, doctors, researchers, healthcare professionals, graduate students from my school and otherwise, lay people, and those in attendance who came simply because they are concerned about racialized maternal health, I encourage us all to take a moment to check in with ourselves and ask, what am I here for? Who am I working with and for? What can I do more of? What can I do better? Who is being left out of these discussions, and how can I work towards greater inclusion? Some of these questions are meant to be uncomfortable because they should challenge us and they should push us out of our comfort zones. And these are the questions that need to be asked not just today, but continuously as we do work in maternal health with racialized women. So with that said, I'm excited to say that there is a stellar lineup of individuals who have come to this conference to speak about some aspect of racialized maternal health. We start with a keynote from Dr. Janet Smiley to ground the conference, and her talk will focus on her work in Indigenous maternal health care and bridging the gap between communities. Following this is Dr. Cynthia Maxwell, who will provide a clinical perspective of maternal complications that are prevalent among racialized women, and her talk will unpack the implications of race and ethnicity. Recognizing the intersectionality of people's identities and lives, Anne-Marie Schauder's talk on the challenges in care provision among the lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and two-spirited community is a critical conversation that we all should look forward to. And I am also excited to hear Leslie Tarasoff discuss perinatal care and outcomes among women with physical disabilities in Canada. There's a panel discussion on maternal health and equity, focusing on what kinds of tools we need to produce a culturally safe environment in maternal health care, which features Dr. Ani Naram, Manavi Handa, Tanya Hales, Dr. Placide Rububaza, Roxana Sultan, and it will be moderated by Rania Al-Mogammer. In the afternoon, Dr. Andrew Howlett and Dr. Simone Vigod will both discuss their work on postpartum depression in mothers and fathers. And rounding out the day is community activist and founder of the Black Daddies Club, Brandon Hay, who's here to give us his thoughts and examples from his ongoing work on Black fatherhood. There's also a poster display, which I can see at the very far side of this room. And please remember to visit as many as you can during lunch and the breaks, keeping in mind that some of the most groundbreaking and innovative research comes from students. And also, a lot of the times when we come to conferences like this, we forget how important it is to support poster presentations. So please do your best to support them today. So it's a big day, everybody. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be in everyone's presence. I'm excited to be here. And just remember that we're all here for a reason. Whatever your reason is, commit to making it count and reinvesting in the maternal health of racialized women. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to interacting with as many of you as possible as the day unfolds. Have a great morning.
Thank you, Dr. Bess, for that for your rousing opening remarks. So next to the podium is Dr. Janet Smiley. I've actually had the pleasure of working with her at the Center for Urban Health Solutions, which is located at St. Michael's Hospital. Dr. Smiley is a family physician and public health researcher, renowned for her research work with Indigenous health. Currently, she's a research scientist at St. Michael's Hospital, where she directs the Well Living House Applied Research Center for Indigenous Infant, Child, and Family Health. Dr. Smiley.
Tansy, and good morning. I want to thank Nikia. Yeah, got it. Yeah, should be good. For the land acknowledgement this morning. And I want to thank the organizers very much for the kind invitation. It's a real honor to be here and be supporting what I framed as a growing conversation then, I guess, around maternal health. So I put up a picture of land, usually just to remind myself to acknowledge land, and that has happened. Anybody know what body of water that is? It's Saskatchewan River. So then the other purpose is for me to try to locate myself a little bit. And often I'll put a picture of prairie, but I think when we're talking about the health of pregnant people, it's important to think about water. And I've sat by that water for days and been reminded about the importance of water. It's good that it's snowing. It's hard in Toronto because we don't always have a lifestyle that where we keep in mind, like today's, like one of 3 storytelling moons, right? So we don't always remember the power of the moon and the connection that the moon has to waters, or take care of water. But when it comes down in that kind of precipitation and slows things down, I guess for myself, sometimes it helps me slow down just a tiny little bit. And I did try to slow down, and I really appreciate the words of Dr. Bess, very powerful words and responsibilities about trying to remember why we're here. So I couldn't really sleep very much, partly maybe because of the moon energy. So I got up this morning and I made a little tobacco tie, and I thought about, well, why would I come here today, and what could I say? And I was reminded, so some of you might have heard me speak before, but I was reminded about this question I used to ask a long, long time ago when I was very early in my career as a family physician delivering babies. And I was working at Anishinaabe Health here, so it goes back into the mid-90s. And I was delivering still babies at Women's College Hospital. And it was very interesting. They tried to put a quota on how many babies people could deliver. And I was kind of like, that's an interesting strategy. Probably Indigenous people and lots of people are going to keep having babies, no matter how many you tell us we're allowed to have. Yeah, so I was kind of busy. I was doing this program called a Women's Health Scholars Program. It was a third year of clinical training in family medicine with an emphasis on maternal health. And they couldn't call it a clinical fellowship because it was in women's health. Anyways, I had to do a little project, and Jan Longboat, who I still get to work with, is a beautiful Haudenosaunee knowledge keeper and elder, was working at Anishinaabe Health too, and I was kind of stressed out and worried and on call and trying not to hurt anybody. Things were happening. Yeah, so there was some client coming in with 7 months pregnant, undiagnosed twins, syphilis, HIV, those kind of things. So, and we still see that. I was trying to figure out why this was happening in Toronto, and also trying to say, well, maybe we should have some conversations, right, about babies. And then I went to Jan and I gave her tobacco. I said, Jan, I'm really worried. I'm concerned. And then I, as a family doctor, got to follow the babies, just like our Indigenous midwives used to get to follow babies for a lifetime and then see them out the other doorway. So then I would see, and not only were there challenges in the pregnancy and challenges in the birth, but actually there was challenges in the early years, so very high rates of hospitalizations. But anyways, Jan said, well, if you want to be worried about the health of the babies, you have to talk to the grandparents. So then it started this whole process that's still ongoing, right? So in the question then I said kukum, which means your grandmother in Cree. What makes a baby well? So that's a question I continue to ask. But this morning I thought about it, and I thought, Nukum, how do we keep our babies well, right? And then, so if that's the seed, and we heard about conversations with grandparents already today, right? So part of it is going to be, what are the best ways that we can support reproduction in our communities? How can we support pregnant people? How can we support those babies and their grandparents? The other pieces I should just say are, like, in terms of my own maternal kin line in that location. So the reason why I put up the prairies is because I come from the waters of a woman named Mavis, who was born Mavis Whitford in Saskatoon, who came from the waters of a woman named Ruby, who was born Ruby Whitford in a road allowance community in Alberta called Phillips, who comes from the waters of a woman named Marguerite Sauvé, who was born in Lac La Biche. So I do have a fairly rooted maternal kin line, and we're matrilineal and matrilocal as Métis people. And those are things that I like to share. I also have mixed European settler ancestry, so Smileys came from County Down. I think it's important because I'm going to switch and start talking frankly about racism soon. So I think it's kind of important to kind of locate myself and also acknowledge that I get classified, sometimes in the city, and then I guess because I'm a little fairer, I get to hear lots of things when people misclassify me, but yeah, I generally don't get followed around in stores or experience that kind of in-your-face racism that others may hear in Toronto, though it happens very interestingly when I get into the prairies, and then people can start racializing me as Métis. Okay, so we started a little late, but that's okay, because I'm just going to try to get a conversation. I'm going to just try to nurture this conversation. But basically, I'm going to talk about the roots of persistent Indigenous health inequities, right? And we've already started hearing a little bit about that. And those are hard realities and hard conversations. But they're not located. They're not located in our pregnant people. They're not located in those new infants, right? They're located in social systems, right? And we're all part of those social systems. So at least where I come from, I'm certainly not immune, right, to thinking within my comfort zone, right, to wanting to be with people who I think are like me. And sometimes even when I don't know it, treating those people preferentially. So I guess that's part of the hard part of the conversation, part of where we have to get uncomfortable, right? Because we're all here because we want to do something different. We know there's a need for a change, right? But actually, sometimes the most important change in the starting of the change is right here. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about community leadership, right? Because that's part of, and then these words get bandied about. But what really happens and what is a real, Indigenous-driven program? And yeah, there's others that could probably speak to that better than me, because I work at a Catholic hospital and a university. So I do work in the community with Indigenous midwives too. And I am accountable to my elders and my teaching lodge and a council of grandparents. And those are my first accountabilities. So that's probably a bit of a saving grace. Okay, and so part of that, because it's not a day-long conversation about Indigenous people, as Janet Smiley might know, which is a very, very small piece of knowing. It's a conversation about diverse peoples, but like certain peoples that actually get socially excluded, and sometimes there's an intersection, right? And in order to understand the roots and address these inequities, we need to try to be actually sometimes very clear. And those of us that do experience targeted racism, we have a pretty good understanding of what that feels like and how to navigate it, right? But the problem is we don't get to talk about that too much outside of our in-group, or it's scary sometimes. So already those are just some observations. So what will it take today, right? Already we've got a beautiful context, but what's going to take for us to have a little bit of a conversation, right? And many of you know already. We all know, right, how to have within group conversations, right? Like more or less. But I'll actually share some information. I guess part of it's punching out space to say to policymakers, we need more gatherings like this, right? We need a series of gatherings like this, right? We need to have within community caucuses in the gatherings, and then sessions where we come together and share more. Yeah, it's really important to have these spaces. So part of it is, okay, well, where's the evidence for that, right? We're just more interested in, some kind of financial model, right? Of, how expensive, who's going to be the most cost-efficacious care provider, right? For maternity care, right? Okay, so maybe I'll get, I can speed up a little bit, but I guess so the takeaways are around racism, externally imposed models, and fear of difference. as some of the key challenges, right? Like, so if we could get rid of all that stuff, yeah, then we could all just go play in the snow, okay? But in part of getting rid of all that stuff, right, and recovering from that stuff, right, is actually recognizing that we all need to work together to create these spaces where members of communities who have been socially excluded, who are actively and have experienced racism, externally imposed models, and other people's fear of difference, right, need to be put in the driver's seat. And when we come together across difference, it takes a lot of humility, shared learning, and at least 1,000 cups of tea. I struggled with the tea thing. One of the problems with doing this work all the time is it can get very busy. In this time of TRC too, there's still a need for, some of you might be smart, how can we actually share the load a little bit, right? Like, so that actually getting rid of the first part, like that first thing, getting rid of all that, that's like actually the work of allies and people that are experiencing social privileges, including myself, right? Yeah, I struggled with tea, but I thought, well, we had our own teas, our muskegee. I did talk to quite a lot of elders on the prairies about what keeps babies well as part of that initiative, and it was always like a word, like, and everyone's like, oh, what's the medicine tea? We want to know what the tea is. It was all just muskegee, like this medicine tea, right? If you could have learned, or if I had stayed and had more cups of tea, I eventually, possibly, mostly just because of the people that brought me into community, would have possibly been told what the cups of tea were made of. Okay, so how many people here have read the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Okay, so it's a hard thing to read, but I think it's a good starting point. I wanted to put, like, take Indigenous cultural safety training too, but I thought, well, okay, I'm just gonna ease up on there. So remember that thing about it's not all about me. So that's actually in the how to start the conversation thing. So, but in fact, when I'm tired, right, like when we're feeling the pain, right, or exhaustion of like attitudinal racism, microaggressions, frank, like in your face aggressions, systemic racism, under-resourcing, then yeah, sometimes it's very hard for me to say, well, actually, it feels like I'm angry, and when I'm angry and overwhelmed, then it's very hard for me to step back and discern that, yeah, this is something that we all need to work together on. So, and then when I'm talking about this model of Indigenous leadership, which I'll try to get to in just a few minutes, I want you to think about how it could apply to the communities you're working with too, right? Like, so it's, because it's just like about putting community that's experienced social exclusion in the driver's seat, and that the answers lie in our communities already. We've been through a lot, right? So yeah, we know how to do this, right? We don't always agree on how to do it, right? And we need to possibly, there's going to be multiple community within community solutions, right? And the more supported we feel, then the more we'll be able to have conversations around when we have process disagreements. Yeah, but we know. And then also, and we've already been challenged, so I am calmer today than I often am, perhaps, but I will try to say a couple outrageous things as I go along. Pretty nice audience, but but can you catch something here? So that's the start of that critical self-reflexivity that I have to remind myself to do every day, right? So is there something I've said, or is there going to be something that is said today that challenges you a little bit, that you're, and rather than just dismissing it, right, say, wait a minute, that makes me uncomfortable. So like I'm just going to, instead of like avoiding it, right? Or like saying, no, it's wrong, right? And just sit with that discomfort a little bit, okay? So I'm specifically asking you to look for when you might feel challenged by something because of your privileged social situation versus your socially excluded position. Yeah. Okay, so a little bit about this well-living house place. People come there like, where's the house? And we're working on it. And just this idea though too, and I think it is important because there's lots of conversations and discussions about what's unfair, right? And how these social inequities translate into horrible and tragic and preventable health inequities, right? And my next slide's gonna say, talk about that. But actually in the end, what we all want, right, in all of our communities and then intersecting across communities is joy, peace, and love, right, for all of our children. And we can achieve it, right? So I guess that's part of it. So why would it be? And I think it's really important to think about joy, peace, and love, health and well-being, thriving Indigenous communities, right? Because we certainly don't see it when we open up the newspaper or listen to the CBC often, even though they try. So our artists help us with that. And that beautiful picture, I better not try to go back, but is by my sister, Christy Belcourt. So here's the question that I often start. Why would it be? Like right here in Toronto, right, Indigenous infants are likely twice as likely to die in their first year of life compared to non-Indigenous infants. So the myth is that all Indigenous, like Indigenous health inequities, like birth outcome inequities are because Indigenous people live far away, far from the hospital. And there's colonial roots to that. Of course, the hospitals in rural areas have been set up near the settler towns, right? And you can show that. But actually, who knows that there's more Indigenous people in the city of Toronto likely than all of Northern Ontario, right? Okay, so, and then who knows that infant mortality and most other health outcomes do not improve in the city, right? So that, in fact, some things get worse. Preterm birth gets worse. Low birth weight gets worse. Okay, so that's what we're challenged with here. And of course, not everybody is here from Toronto either, just like everybody is not wanting a Cree Métis perspective on the world. Didn't tell too many Métis stories yet. To me, that is unacceptable, right? Like, and it's the same for other socially excluded groups. And we have to be like, so people who are racialized as Black here in the city of Toronto, even though we have all of these different hospitals and beautiful places, yeah, are having birth outcomes, right, that are inequitable to people who are racialized from other racial groups. Who knows what this building is? I'm getting old now. Okay, so thank you, Jill, good for you. Did you want to share what it is, or I can just say it's yeah, so Sioux Lookout Hospital. So who knows that in Toronto, up until 10 years ago, we had apartheid healthcare right here in Ontario. So there was 2 hospitals in the town of Sioux Lookout. One hospital was for the people that lived in the town, which were a mix of Indigenous and settler people, but predominantly settlers. And one hospital was for the First Nations people that lived in the surrounding First Nations communities. So, and the hospital actually, it was interesting because when I got up there in the late 80s, I was like, oh, this is a weird place, and people don't really seem to like it, though there had been that community ownership, which is amazing and like so resilient. Said, oh, I'm at 20. I have 20 minutes left. Oh, that's scary. It was an old TB sanatorium, right? So, and it's just, there's stories. We talk about stories, right? We heard about like chasing down some stories, right? But yeah, it's very interesting to find out the stories of places as well, right? Because we're talking about asking the grandparents, right? So I think it was important for people to understand the story of that place. Okay, so what do we do about this usually in health services? So I'm a family doctor, right? So, and it's not to say that communities should not ask for more health service providers or more tertiary care facilities, or that it's not a human right to have access to those things. I just made the point that I want people to have access to those things that we have in this city, but they don't seem to be getting access, right? And there's not really 50 doctors in Sioux Lookout, but when I Googled, because a lot of people are not living there, they're not working full time. But you can actually follow, and I think my colleague, Dr. Angela Mashford Pringle, is doing some interesting archival work, looking at even the history of my own prestigious academic institution, or the one I belong to, U of T, and its role in the expansion of health services in this area. But the thing is, you can just keep expanding and expanding health services. But the health disparities in this area anyways don't seem to be getting any better, right? So, and I think I'm speaking to the converted in the group. So it's not, we heard in Barbados how there is a system, right, where everybody's getting access to prenatal care, right? But still there's not access to life-saving information around postpartum depression. So the issue is, it's not only like access, right? It's not only like how much, it's what and how. Okay, so this hypothesis comes from maybe right around asking about the cook and what makes a baby well question, right? So this idea that this kind of biomedical approach in isolation is going to have minimal impact on addressing the health disparities. We actually need to think about local Indigenous knowledge and practice. And that's how we're going to support our pregnant people again, right? Nurture new life. That was me at Anishinaabe Health. Okay, so why is it that we have these externally imposed systems, right? And why is it that specific racialized groups like Indigenous people and people who are racialized as Black, most consistently in the US we have data about people, US has horrible labels, and I'll talk, part of the conversation thing, the humility for me and the shared learning is actually learning the language. I make a joke, we try to make it complicated in Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, Métis community, like what do you call us? And then, oh, it was Aboriginal, now it's Indigenous. And in fact, I had a colleague I've worked with for about 25 years email me because I was making up something and I said Indigenous, and they had emailed me back and they said, no, it has to be First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, right? And then we have then some people will say, but what about the non-status Indians, right? And it's Indian in the Constitution. So it's confusing. So then when I speak about other groups who are experiencing racialized or ethnic social challenge, I don't know the right language, and I'm aware of it, right? But that's okay, right? Because there's places where you can have that conversation, and it's not that hard to learn, right? Because I guess for a while in Canada, because just because I focus so much on Indigenous health, it didn't make me an expert in knowing what would be the right language that I should use with my racialized brothers and sisters, right? So, and the word racialized emerged, right? Because we used to kind of say Black, but uncomfortably. But I understand, and then I'm like, oh, is that like when we call each other Indian at home or party Indian, but then we don't like other people? My boys get mad because they're like, the teacher called us Indian, that's wrong, right? It was racist, right? So then now I think, so part of it is for me to be humble, right? And part of it is just for me to do my homework, right? And then part of it is the humility. Self-depreciating humor can be helpful, but also just to name it. Because if we can't even know the respectful terms by which we can talk about each other or respect the ways in which we want to self-identify, and for sure when we're talking about gender diverse and queer community, again, it's the same set of issues. So that's kind of the basic boot camp. But for me, I think we actually need some spaces. I know a lot of the gender diverse youth and Indigenous community have helped me, right? So they're kind of patient, and we have the exercise where you have to sit beside somebody and then introduce them and use gender neutral language, right? So, and at first I was like, okay, what's in a word, right? But actually, what's in a word is actually respect. I'm going to interweave those little pieces around how to start the conversations. So I'm pretty sure if one didn't know the right language, then like you can just look it up on Grandma Google, right? And then, and if you're still kind of awkward. But what I was going to say, so in the States, the word Latino, so I'm still like, because they have white, black, Latino, they had the Native Hawaiians mixed up with the Asians, right? So that language is just language that is not language that I think the people who are being named would like to be used about them. But of course, those are groups that we know. And so anyways, in the US, and that's where I did my public health training because we didn't have schools of public health yet in Canada, there has been this frank literature and talk about race for a long time. So I like to show Unequal Treatment. I don't know if people have seen that book before, but some of you might work with colleagues who are saying, oh yeah, we get racism in the past, but it's all done now. It's Toronto, right? So then you're just like, oh, well, isn't that interesting? So the thing is, for those of you that need a little book, you can, oh, well, the Institute of Medicine said it was alive and well 15 years ago, but we're not really talking about it in Canada, right? And with respect to Indigenous people, if you look at the scholarship now, people will talk about colonization, racism, and engendered racism and political marginalization. And then, of course, linked to that, the state of our lands and waters. Like that Saskatchewan River, right? Where the oil dumped in, right? 2 years ago now. The TRC report, that was part of your homework, so I can't go into very good detail, right, about these roots, and I want to shift over to some solutions. But this is Senator Murray Sinclair. I think he's a hero. So one of the challenges in what I said, so is like just finding that basic language so we can begin to have these cross-cutting conversations. So I say, I think it's impossible to have been educated in Canada and not actually have a whole bunch of entrenched racist stereotypes. I think the curriculums are just finally changing a little bit. And then I understand for people who have come to Canada in this lifetime, that actually the information that is shared, unless you do some extra work, yeah, there's still room for improvement in terms of the information that people might get when they're coming to Canada. One of the things that is very disturbing to me, so of course those of us that understand or experience racism in all its different ways understand then for different groups of people who are racialized, it unfolds in different ways. There's some similarities, but I think for Indigenous people, one of the things that is very striking, especially if I think about stuff around gender or like language, is that it seems that it's still okay for people to talk about us or to write about us or to be in charge of us, right? Or to steal our narratives in a way that's very shocking. So for example, I still get called racist regularly because I would suggest that an Indigenous person should be in charge of an Indigenous Health Institute. And I think, well, I wonder what would have happened in the 80s before we really had evolved feminism and they said, well, a guy's going to be in charge of this feminist institute, right? Or would they really put like a white person in charge of a black health institute? But anyways, don't know. It could all happen, yeah. So discomfort with discomfort and fear of difference and how that is a critical part of colonization still, right? And kind of here is this very shocking picture of Thomas More. So Regina Industrial School, so he's Cree boy, maybe a Blackfoot boy, someone would help me, but so I look at him and I look at my own children, right? And think, sometimes we're actually like, his hair's messy, right? But you can still, like somehow, somebody's dressed him, his regalia has persisted through whatever processes brought him to that school. But yeah, I guess, so this is, in a way, this could be what's happened to our maternity services too, right? Our care for pregnant people in our community, right? So how do we get back and how do we actually support and nurture this boy whose name wasn't Thomas? And how do we support him? And how do we do it when we're working in hospitals and universities? Yeah, epistemic racism. So a very important Cree-Métis midwife colleague of mine, Shirley Bourgeois, framed this as the problem with universities, right? The problem with universities is they support the idea that we know better, right? But in this area, like the thing is, I don't think we do know better, right? And linked to colonization. So more reading about racism, just in case you want to hand somebody a pile of paper. Pile of paper works sometimes, right? Though, interestingly, right when this came out, I was just sharing a story. Someone told me I wasn't a social scientist, right, in my faculty. They're actually blocking supervision and promotion. I said, okay, I know I'm an MD with a master's, so there's lots of MDs with masters doing bad social science, and it was funny, I just fell right into it. I rationalized, I explained, you know, I actually have all this postdoctoral training with like social scientists. You just get trapped. Then I got angry. I was like, I worked hard to get those badges of credibility, right? I worked hard to learn those master's tools, and I know that they're the same Boy Scout badges that all those white guys have. Then I was like, well, if you don't think I'm a social scientist or I don't know social theory, let's have a discussion. I'll debate you, right? Isn't that what we're supposed to do? None of those things happened. I did get an apology 2 years later. The other piece, though, so just another little woven in story, because I think I want to try to finish up in the next 5 to 10 minutes, yeah? Is just around cross-cutting conversations. So the origin of this book, first we should acknowledge Dr. Billie Allen, a heroic Indigenous woman who's living in the West Coast now, but who was the lead author and very passionate about the health of Indigenous women here in this city. But what happened is, do some of you know about a report called Color-Coded Healthcare that came out of the Wellesley Institute? So Color-Coded Healthcare by Joan Nessel came out of the Wellesley Institute, speaking about the impact of racism, the foundational impact of racism on health, right? It's as important as poverty, right? So I tried to get Michael Marmot to admit that, and I think he might be getting swayed. But I was invited to a gathering at the Wellesley Institute then to discuss color-coded healthcare, right? And part of it was this common dilemma, well, what should we do about, like, Indigenous people, right? So there had been a decision, well, Indigenous experiences, are different than the experiences of racism experienced by racialized settlers, right? So Indigenous people then weren't included, but there was no kind of follow-up plan. So that's that awkward piece of the conversation. Again, it was like, and for me, even at the Wellesley, I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. There's all these awesome, like, and stellar voices of people who I'm racializing as Black. Like, this is like a really cool conversation. But I think that, I'm trying to think, there was something that happened. It was Idle No More. And a couple things happened after that winter. Because I was just like, okay, well, it's not really okay just to leave out Indigenous people. We're kind of like the first peoples. So, like, but how do we navigate it in a good way, right? Like, I think that in January, I had 2 people from Wellesley come to my office and they said, you know what? We want to do an Indigenous, like, color-coded healthcare now, and we want you to do it, right? So that was really cool, right? Because sometimes we do need to say, these are different stories. They can't all go in one report, right? But then, yeah, there's that support and making room then, like, for each of the stories to be described, right, in a good way, right? And then we can power up together, right? If we try to do collective work too soon, before we know the conversations, right? Or, we're too afraid, right, to say, okay, well, I don't even know really how to talk about health inequities for other racialized groups, right? Like in there, see, I did it. I used the other word, right? I mostly know how to talk about it for Indigenous people, but I want to learn, and I'm going to. Okay. So this is just a study that also shows that in New Zealand, where they know how to find Indigenous people, because they're 15% of the population, that they showed that you have to adjust for both socioeconomic deprivation or poverty and experiences of racist attack, and then you get to then you can explain health inequities, okay? But so it's just the bizarre thing. So we do have lots of activism, right? We have a Black Health Alliance. We have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But yeah, I would still say there's room to move in terms of actually naming and addressing racism, right? So we racialize as human beings because we don't know, right? But it happens. So if we just pretend we don't, that doesn't improve inequities, right? Like the head in the color blindness, head in the sand approach has been shown not to work, right? But if we call it racism, then we're actually like moving the problem onto the privileged, racially privileged settler groups, right? Like my dad's ancestors. And then that's where the solution needs to come from, right? And we don't need to be asking racialized folks or Indigenous folks to tell us that we're racialized or Indigenous when we go to get services that we already feel unsafe for. Because sometimes if we can lie, we will, right? And it's not going to fix it. What we need to do is measure the racism among the people who are providing those services. Measure that and fix that. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so here, oh. You should see, I have to go back because it's a beautiful picture. Oh. Maybe if I try this button. My sons complain, I have twin boys, that I had a little late in life. And so I'm a little hard of hearing from a very awesome Elton John concert. My son thought that we were also hard of sight, right? Because he's like, well, you guys are old. Like, can you still see things? So anyways, we were just like, actually, luckily, I still... I think I have fairly good sight. That doesn't always deteriorate as quickly as hearing, as an aging thing. Okay, just be patient with me and I'll get back to that picture. Okay, so I was at a gathering. There's an annual Indigenous health gathering that U of T puts on, and Phil Fontaine was there. He was on with 2 white allies. And I felt that day, I was worried he wasn't getting enough voice. But the one thing he said that day is the answers lie in our communities. The other guys were trying to make an argument that genocide happened to Indigenous people. I was kind of like, yeah, okay, maybe we could like warn people and there could be like some other activity that we could do while you convince all the non-Indigenous people that it happened. But so who knows what this is? Okay, awesome. Okay, so the thing is, not only do we want thriving infants and families, we also want to have thriving services. And actually, when you put the community in the driver's seat, we can get something. It's not just like equity, like, oh, good, it's not so pitiful anymore for Janet and her people. Or, yeah, we actually get something that's better for everybody, right? So the Toronto Birth Centre, right? You see Christy Belcourt art in there, right? An Indigenous governance model, and many of you are actively participating and supporting. And we flipped like the social exclusion of Indigenous people and people who are racialized and poor in terms of access to midwifery on its head, right? We still have to say like vulnerable targets or something like that, but yeah, I think, yeah, you know how it is. But like that's pretty awesome, right? Like, and I think it's a pretty awesome place. So this is like a little bit about if you want to punch out space and see how you get there, and you can pull this down for those of you who like to read a pile of paper. I was all proud because it was another Boy Scout badge to get into social science and medicine, but it's actually a pretty heavy-duty methods paper that says something that we already knew, right? The answers lie in our communities, right? But this is the piece. We said, how did we actually, what is this Indigenous community leadership thing, and how do you get it, right? And then what are its impacts, right? So basically, we theorized that there was a pathway of Indigenous community investment, ownership and activation. So in all funny words in English, so we try to come up with a Cree word. My grandmother, Ruby, was the last person in my kin line that was a fluent Cree speaker, but she hid it from me her whole life, and I didn't have the courage to ask about that. But the idea is that if the program comes from the people, then people actually will perceive it's their program. So it's this whole thing. We in-group and out-group, and that can be bad because then we feel uncomfortable when we get out of our comfort zone. But it actually can be powerful within our in-group, because then as an in-group, if we create something, then we're more likely to use it. And if you do it in a very systematic way, so we had this, here, we had this thing called community investment, and my colleague and friend Sarah Wolf coined that term. And it's funny because it's not like investment banking, but it's actually, do you have your skin in the game, right? Like, so that, you know, we can come here, we can see, right? Like Elsie, Nakia here, people, like this thing is gonna go. There's a snowstorm, but there's like, you know, 150 people in this room, right? So like, this is a community event, and it's actually pretty powerful because it's cutting across diverse communities, so that's kind of a little bit of a brave thing to do, right? So anybody ever go to a community gathering and like you're going in and then no one's there, and then you're kind of like, oh, I didn't even really go in that room, right? Versus something, and I always compare, like my auntie is good at gatherings, like maybe the best that I know. And anyways, yes, you go to that gathering and it's like, oh, there's nothing I need to do here, right? That's, it's gonna be a go. It happened when we had the, we have a baby bundles project. Ann Simon's right there. I gotta put in a pitch, talk to her, because we're trying to do more community mobilization in Indigenous community and provide more wraparound services for our moms. So if you know of Indigenous pregnant people, we wanna connect with them. Yeah, we had a gathering in October, and it's a bit of a research-heavy project because we want to show in like non-Indigenous spaces that what we already know works. Yeah, I went in, I was like, oh, this is good. I don't have to do anything, right, except, yeah, eat and have a cup of tea, right? The community's taken over this thing, and so for me, that's actually a concrete sign of success. So some of the strategies, and again, I don't want to lecture y'all here because you're all like doing this community investment and community development stuff, but I guess part of it is to think about those things and actually, like you can say now, yeah, and actually this isn't just like on the side of the Play-Doh, the ministry will give you a little bit of money for this community stuff to keep you happy. This is like the core work, right? But you have to be brave, right? You have to be brave like that midwife that we heard about. Lots of you. So you all have things that you're doing, and yeah, external to community people are saying that's not how we do things. And then even sometimes in community people are saying that's not how we do things. I kind of talked about the growing conversations as I went through, but I guess part of the pieces for me, I hope I was able to bring are Many of you are having those conversations. That's your core work, right? That's your core community work, those kitchen table conversations, those cups of tea. And that's actually the richest place for the transmission of the knowledge and practice that we need to have to support our pregnant people and grow healthy babies and address those health inequities. And then, like, this is what's so awesome about today is, like, there's people from diverse communities who are struggling and having conversations. So now we're trying to create like a complex web, right? So it's a spider web, right? So we need to respect that there will be times when we need to break out in caucus and have smaller group conversations. That's the other weird thing, you know, with all this big hospital mergers and stuff, right? Like the lack of understanding that actually as human beings we're so complex, right? And so now we have to have intersectionality, but we've always had like core groups, and then there's always been people that move across and between groups, right? Like we know how to do some of this stuff already. It's part of our histories. Our grandparents can help us with it. So this is just the slides where I say like what I was trying to get to. So I hope that I've been able to get at some of the roots of persistent Indigenous health inequities. I'm hoping that some of what I've said might resonate for those of you who are experiencing inequities based on other forms of social positioning. And then I tried to speak a bit about leadership and highlight its importance. And it's a big, I didn't drill down, but we're really trying to actually produce and punch out space. Like, so that's actually really acknowledged, right? It's like women's work, right? Like, so, you know, leadership, community development, it gets marginalized, right? Because women and people who choose to be in community, right, are good at it, right? Also, I've humbly shared some observations about the development of conversations, but you've got like a super day ahead of you. And actually one of the most important things is going to be shifting from somebody like me talking at you to, yeah, turning your chair around and talking to the person next to you. So, yeah, I don't know that we have time for questions. I will, Elsie's dealing with snowstorms and long-winded speakers this morning, and I do want to show due respect for the rest of the conversation, but I will try to stick around for a little bit in case people need to see me. I was one of those people that had to do something else. I have to go talk to the ethics board at St. Mike's, but that's not because I'm not committed or honored in terms of being here. It's just because I'm having trouble navigating in this world that I choose to locate myself in, which is kind of actually hanging out in a big hospital and university most of the time, just trying to punch out spaces and acquire resources and transfer them to y'all. So yeah, enjoy the day, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Smiley, for that frank and honest discussion that we've just, well, not discussion, but as Dr. Smiley said, she'll be around so you can talk to her and actually discuss a little bit more. So just as Dr. Smiley said and Dr. Bess have said, you know, we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? We need to have those conversations. So next, in terms of speakers, is Dr. Cynthia Maxwell. She'll be talking about clinical examples of complications prevalent with racialized women. Dr. Maxwell is an associate professor at the University of Toronto and a maternal fetal medicine specialist and division head at Mount Sinai Hospital, where she works within the medical disorders of pregnancy program to treat medical and surgical complications of pregnancy. Dr. Maxwell?
Good morning, everyone. It's a real honor to be here and a delight to share a little bit of my knowledge with you. As I see familiar faces in the audience as well, hello. To Dr. Smiley's point about thinking about your grandparents, I am communing right now with my grandmother, who was a midwife, and she herself delivered all 10 of her pregnancies at home, the 11th being a twin pregnancy. I think that was fairly late in her reproductive life, and I think must have been one of her last ovulations, I suspect. And thinking about how strong she was. And one of the great things that she always mentioned that she was so proud of is that she never lost any of her children. So thinking about infant mortality and what that must have been like in the 40s and the 50s, and getting through all of those difficult labors. I also reflected for a moment on what would she think about this conference? So she herself was of French and Irish descent and came from the Miramichi region of New Brunswick in the east. But what would she think about having, I guess, a mixed race granddaughter who's now a high-risk obstetrician, and what are the obstetrical and prenatal issues that we worry about today? Because I think that her concerns were probably a little different than the things I'm going to touch on. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the medical issues that I think are very common that we face in pregnancy care. And then I'm going to insert a little bit about the race part at the end. And I say it that way because it's very much how I think most clinicians approach these issues. We think about the medical problem, but then the social underpinnings and influences kind of come as an afterthought. So hopefully we'll start to reverse that process. But let's start, and we'll talk a little bit about the world that I work in, and that is in high-risk pregnancies. So we'll talk about some definitions. What is a high-risk pregnancy? I'll tell you a little bit about some of the racial factors in a few very common conditions, and then we can hopefully conclude and discuss. And if you have questions or you'd like to ask anything during the lecture, please feel free to do so. So a high-risk pregnancy, we try not to call it that, by the way. So our area is called maternal fetal medicine. So that's sort of a nicer way of saying it rather than saying high risk, because it sort of sounds a bit negative. But anyway, just to make it simple, we think about it as any pregnancy where there might be a chronic medical condition for the mother. So that could include things like diabetes, hypertension, even fibroids, or any pregnancy that might be an assisted reproductive pregnancy. For example, people who have in vitro fertilization to achieve pregnancy have a certain set of risks associated with those pregnancies, which not everyone is aware of, I think. There are medical conditions that arise specifically in pregnancy, so things like gestational hypertension, gestational diabetes. There can be conditions of the liver, the heart, as well as fluid that can come from the pregnancy and travel through the mother's system, which can cause very serious complications. There can be emergencies that arise in pregnancies, so things like appendicitis, for example, trauma, infection, other chronic diseases that have exacerbations. And then finally, pregnancies themselves have very unique problems that don't occur in any other aspect of our healthcare. So for example, issues around preterm birth, preterm labor, infections, chorioamnionitis, placenta previa, postpartum hemorrhage. There are different conditions of the fetus as well that we have to consider. So in maternal fetal medicine, we think of the mother, we think of the baby, and then there are all these issues that arise around the development of the fetus very early on in the pregnancy. So congenital abnormalities, we can touch upon those, as well as multiple gestations. So that's just an overview for the area that I work in, and I also deliver a few babies here and there. So is race a risk factor? Let's think about it. So if we think about very common conditions, I thought I would focus on three: obesity, hypertension, and diabetes. These are problems that I encounter a lot in my practice. So obesity is one of the most common risk factors in pregnancy, probably in healthcare in general. And we think of, if we want to categorize obesity, there's this measure called body mass index. So basically you take your height, you take your weight, there's a calculation, and then you're able to get this number called a body mass index. The number itself I don't think has any intrinsic meaning, it's just a ratio. It's a kind of a way to figure out where one's weight and height fit on the spectrum of weights and height for our population. In my particular clinic, I will see women with levels of obesity or body mass index that are 40 and over. There are certainly health risks associated with entering a pregnancy if you happen to be in that category of body mass index. But we know that women that have overweight, so at BMI levels that are at 25 and over, still have certain health risks associated. So it's a very common issue. In North America, you're probably aware that the rates of overweight and obesity have been rising. there is, so on this map, you can see there's Canada, there's the United States, and everywhere the tone of the color gets darker and darker and darker, that is where there are higher percentages of overweight and obesity in the population. So if you look at some of the southern United States, over a third of all people who live in those areas have overweight and obesity. In Canada, it's a little bit different. I think Ontario is highlighted as having one of the, well, not one of the highest rates. I guess that's probably further out east where we see more like a third or 27, 28% rates in Newfoundland and Labrador. But in Ontario, we are hovering around 18 to 20%. So that's a significant number of our population. I think that reflects the groups that we see at our hospitals as well. So it's a very common risk factor. This is not to say that everyone who has overweight and obesity is unhealthy. That's not at all the case. But there are risks attached to these different levels of weight, and so that's what we're going to talk about, and what are the potential complications. So when we think about the fetal risks, so the risks to the baby developing inside the mother, if there is obesity present, there's all sorts of stuff, and it gets maybe a little bit discouraging because it's a long list. But anyway, we have to know about these things. There are issues around congenital anomalies. So if you look at across different weight categories, there are higher risks of problems like spina bifida, so problems with the spine, neural tube, as well as with the heart. When we are trying to look at these issues on ultrasound, it's a little challenging. So depending on the body habitus and how thick the body wall is, it can be very hard to image these structures on ultrasound. So that's a little bit of a challenge for those of us who are doing the ultrasounds. When we get later in pregnancy, sometimes we like to have an idea of how big the baby is to help us with delivery planning. So if we think that a baby could be in the 12-pound range, that is a useful piece of information because that might affect how we plan or when we plan the birth and the support that we might need around that birth. So ultrasound is a helpful thing for us because we can make estimates. They're not perfect, they're estimates, but it can help us gauge what we might anticipate for birth weight. And that is a little bit more difficult in this population. We can have larger babies, as I just mentioned. There are issues around being born early or being late. There can be injury for larger babies born to mothers of increased weight during the birth process. So if you get essentially stuck in the birth canal, there are some complications that can arise as a result. There are high rates of stillbirth, reduced rates of breastfeeding, the microbiome. All of you having your probiotics, if you have them regularly in your diet, you should. It's very good for your health. But with overweight and obesity, there can be a change in your microbiome, which basically changes your hormones and the way you experience hunger and satiety and so on. So you can alter these by altering your diet with time. And we don't really know what the consequences of all of this are for our healthcare in the long term, but this is an emerging area of study. And then the other thing is this whole issue of the circle of obesity and metabolic health, that if you have one parent who is overweight or obese, it increases your chances, I think, by 20 or 30%. If you have two parents who are overweight and obese, your chances of having obesity in the future are over 50%. So it goes around and around. We know that there are risks to the baby. So during birth, I've already alluded to that. This graph is just to illustrate that as you move along body mass index classes, that the risk of having an injury to the newborn increases. And that's irrespective of whether it's a natural birth, a vaginal birth, or a cesarean birth, all births. So there are clearly risks involved that seem to be most prominent when we get to the higher levels of body mass index. With regard to the mother, we know that there are several medical conditions associated with increased body mass index in pregnancy. So that includes things like I've already mentioned, hypertension or high blood pressure, diabetes. There is a trend towards increased weight gain. So there are certain levels of weight that we anticipate women to have gained during pregnancy, but the numbers tend to be higher depending on what the body mass index is when you start. Problems with labor, lower chances of having a normal labor if one has had a cesarean birth before, and so on. One of the areas that I work in a lot is caring for wounds and cesarean recovery for this group, and that's a lot of work. It's time intensive and very difficult when you have a newborn and you're trying to recover from a complication of giving birth. Reduced rates of breastfeeding are a big concern, and so there are many reasons for this. We can get into them, but we now know from recent significant information that the more breastfeeding is promoted, the less likely those children are to go on to develop diabetes and other metabolic conditions in the future. So breastfeeding is a really important thing that we need to spend more time encouraging and supporting. And then, of course, psychological issues around recovery from birth, particularly if there are complications or if you've been worried about these complications throughout the whole pregnancy. So, oh, and wait a minute, it's very common in some groups. So this is kind of how the clinicians are. We understand what the medical problems are, but then we sort of think about, well, who do they primarily affect afterwards? I really searched far and wide to try to find this kind of data for Canadian populations. It's really very difficult to find. I mean, I couldn't find any ethnic breakdown of pregnancy outcomes anywhere, not in Health Canada, not at the Canadian Diabetes site. So I thought, that's perplexing. And I think that reflects the reality is that we don't know this information in our population. The best I can do is extrapolate from some of the American data. So I think that there's certainly a tradition of collecting this information in most of the American obstetric studies, and I think across medicine in general. This particular graph shows us that obesity rates for women, so I just moved to the women, not the general population, are as follows. So you can see that it's about over a third for all adults in the United States. But then if you look at women who are identified as Black, it's over 50%. So this is just obesity. If you include overweight and obesity, which is another graph, I think it was over 70% or close to 70%. It's quite shocking. I mean, that's certainly a large number. So that means it's widespread, and that there are significant risks for many of these individuals going into pregnancy. But I wonder if the counseling is any different for Black women in America than it would be for other women. I just choose this particular example of this ethnic group, but of course, if we were to look at Indigenous or First Nations people in the United States, I'm sure that we would find some very interesting risk factors in those groups as well. Latino, I'm not even sure if that's the right term, or is it Hispanic? I'm not sure which term is the right one to use, but you can see that the overweight and obesity rates are also higher in this group. So something to think about. We'll talk about a couple more problems and then see what to make of all of this. Hypertension, so high blood pressure. When there's extra pressure in your blood vessels, we usually characterize this problem as when your blood pressure is greater than 140/90. We care about blood pressure for all individuals because it obviously affects your risk of heart disease and things like that in the future. In pregnancy, we know that it predisposes women to developing a condition called a superimposed gestational hypertension. Most of us still call it preeclampsia. I think that's the more common word to use. And the reason it's important is that the effects of hypertension and the way that it affects the blood vessels impacts the development of the fetus. So on the right side of your screen, you can see there's two blood vessels. I guess is this a pointer? It is. Yes. See if I can point with this. Does it point? Oh, it does point. Okay. So I'll try this one over here. So in a normal pregnancy, there's an interaction between the placenta and the uterus. So basically, I hope I have that right. Actually, I think this is the placenta and this is the uterus. So the placenta must kind of invade the uterus and transform some of its blood vessels and help create a very intimate communication between two sets of circulation, one from the pregnancy and one from the mom. So the blood vessels need to be kind of nicely, widely spaced, and they have to allow lots and lots of blood to kind of filter through and wash back and forth. So that's what normal transformation of blood vessels looks like in pregnancy. That would be at a microscopic level. In pregnancies that are affected by a kind of high blood pressure, that transformation doesn't happen so well. So the arteries remain kind of narrow, they're kind of stiff, they don't allow the blood to flow in as well. And with time, this affects the placenta so that it doesn't reach its potential size, and as a consequence, doesn't nourish the baby as well as it could. And then there are some other side effects that manifest as maternal problems in pregnancy that we know as either toxemia of pregnancy, preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, with or without proteinuria, all different names for the same thing. So when we have the gestational hypertension, if it achieves its most severe form, we can develop, as mothers, we can develop many different complications. So it can affect the brain, the liver, the blood system, kidneys, and lungs. So we know that mothers who have this condition, if they have the severe forms, can develop seizures, swelling of the brain. They can even have strokes from bleeds at that time. The liver can become very irritated. It starts to release a lot of enzymes, and it's possible that there can be bleeding within that liver. It can even lead to liver failure. The blood system gets disrupted, so people can develop a problem with their blood clotting, which can be quite severe. All of this requires hospitalization and eventual delivery, by the way. And so there's other organs that are affected as well. The other consequence to all of this is that sometimes the baby has to be delivered early. So there may be preterm delivery because it has to happen. It may be that preterm birth comes about because of all of the things that are going on in the mother's body. There are clearly risks to the fetus's life in this process. And the placenta may decide to separate earlier than it should, so that can endanger the baby. And then some of the things that I was referring to about the blood vessels and how they communicate, how the mother's blood vessels communicate with the baby's and placenta's blood vessels are important because it can lead to problems in the baby's growth and well-being and can set off this cascade of issues that becomes preeclampsia. So how about this hypertension thing, and what about the racial connection here? So this is a study from 2014. It's a huge database study of over 50,000 American women. Again, I did search, looked for something like this in Canada. I could not find it. But just to give you an idea, that if you look at the orange bars, which are the tallest ones, these are the rates of preeclampsia, both mild and severe forms. I just kind of put them together to give you an idea. But you can see that in this particular cohort of women, 8% of Black women end up with preeclampsia, and that it's about 3.6 with gestational hypertension. You can see how those numbers look for the Hispanic women. That's in the next category. And then the other category they always report on are Asian and Pacific Islanders, but I'm never sure, I don't know which Asian they're referring to, but anyway, that's how these are reported in the American literature. I suspect we would report it differently if it was in Canada, but in any case, you do see that this is a significant issue. When we talk about preeclampsia, a complication of hypertension in pregnancy in the clinic, I usually tell people, your chances are probably about 5%, and I just say that for everybody, but I never think about the fact that, well, if you're from a particular group, actually maybe I should be refining that risk assessment. I think that's typical of most physicians. I don't think we tend to focus on the person's background and then think, well, actually we should be modifying your risk, but it's food for thought, and I think that going through these issues and thinking about them this way has started to stimulate my thoughts as well. Let's touch on diabetes. So we all know that diabetes is usually an issue of how we metabolize and handle sugar, and that too much of it and too little insulin leads to the clinical condition of diabetes. It has lots of effects on blood vessels in our bodies, and so of course in pregnancy we're interested in the blood vessels that are in the placenta because that has an impact on the baby's development as well as on the mother's well-being during pregnancy. We know that diabetes is on the rise, so there are so many dietary changes in all parts of the world that rises in levels of obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome are pretty much universal. It's anticipated that world diabetes cases will jump by 55% by 2035, so that's a significant health impact. And if you look at the countries that are likely to be most affected by this, actually Canada didn't make the list, so I guess it's good, but we don't have as many people, I suppose. But if you look at China, this will affect 100 million people almost. That's an enormous number of people affected by diabetes. So in Canada, we do have some information. I didn't realize that it was as pervasive as this, so maybe I'll go over to this side. Actually, I can't see that screen, so I'll have to do this one. There are 29% of Canadians that are currently living with diabetes. That's a third of our population. Did you know that? That's a lot of diabetes, isn't it? And that it's estimated that 3.4 million people have diabetes. It's very costly to the healthcare system, as we can imagine, and that we can attribute 1 in 10 deaths in Canadian adults related to complications of diabetes. So it's a big problem. When we think about the fetal risks, so this is where I start to get more involved. We have to do a lot of assessments for babies of mums that have diabetes coming into pregnancy, because we know that there are various abnormalities that can be associated with diabetes, particularly if it's not under very good control going into pregnancy. I just put this picture of the little fetus with what's called spina bifida. It's a type of neural tube defect, and it is more common in women that have diabetes. So basically, with diabetes, if there's excess sugar in your system, it acts as a little bit of a toxin to blood vessels that are developing. And so if these blood vessels happen to be developing and trying to nurture the growth of the spinal cord, and they are affected at just the right time, then this area over the spine doesn't close over, and then you can end up with this problem called spina bifida. And it obviously can lead to disabilities, difficulty with walking and ambulating and so on. But the other issue is that because the spinal cord is not contained the way it normally should, there can be changes in the brain. So the brain kind of gets pulled down and misshapen. And then there can be some cognitive issues that arise from this in the future as well. Swelling of the brain, hydrocephalus, and so on. I was just thinking about Dr. Smiley's comments when she mentioned the high rate of infant mortality in the indigenous communities here in Canada, and we should be able to fix that. Like, we're in Canada, we have a great healthcare system. There's no reason to have high rates of infant mortality in any group, and we can fix spina bifida now. So in our hospital this last summer. Summer of 2017, my colleagues in the fetal medicine group performed the first repair of spina bifida for a fetus in utero. So before the baby was born, they fixed it. Just sew it up. It's obviously it's more complicated, but it worked. It works very well. And that baby was born a few months ago, and you might have seen the press releases, and it's amazing. It's wonderful. It's great that we can do this. The outcome is such that that little person will likely be able to walk and play sports and probably not have many of the brain complications that people sometimes develop if they have a spina bifida that's only treated after their birth. So we can do that. How come we can't fix the infant mortality? Like, it doesn't make sense, right? So I know that we have to obviously think about how we use our resources and address important medical issues. But anyway, just food for thought. So a lot of resources go into taking care of these types of issues, as you can imagine. So if we think about diabetes by race, it's, again, difficult to find this information about Canadians, so it comes from CDC. This is US data. But you can see where the American Indian, and I think that's the terminology that's used in the United States, they refer to those groups as American Indians, Alaska Natives, about 16% of the population. So that's a large number. In Blacks, 13%, Hispanic, Latino, 13%, and then Asians, 9%. So very common risk factors. So with diabetes, of course, if you know it's there, it's really good if you can try to take care of it before the pregnancy comes about, because you can do a lot to change the risk profile in pregnancies in the future if the diabetes is well cared for. We normally recommend, if we know somebody has diabetes, and they are planning a pregnancy. So maybe they've thought about it, they're going to start their family, so they come and have a chat with either their physician, their midwife, family doctor, and so they'll talk about contraception. So stay on contraception until you're sure that your diabetes is under good control. So there's a measurement we use called the hemoglobin A1C. It's kind of like a little snapshot of how somebody's been doing over the last few months. Have their sugars been too high, or have they been just about right? And if they're just about right, then it's probably reasonable to start pregnancy planning, starting some folic acid in anticipation of that, so some vitamins to take about 2 to 3 months before one conceives. But if it's not in a good level, it would be good to work on that before, because we know that the higher the hemoglobin A1C, the more likely you are to have a baby that might have abnormalities. So screening for diabetes complications, so watch for things like eye problems, heart problems, kidney problems, and try to optimize those before you go into pregnancy. And then there's some medications that individuals who have diabetes have to take regularly to try to preserve their kidney function and heart function for the future. And some of those medications, for example, medicines called ACE inhibitors and ARBs, they can't be given in pregnancy because they can cause complications and abnormalities themselves. So those have to be stopped and then usually substituted for something else. All of this requires planning, so it's good to talk about it ahead of time. But do we think about this in terms of the different groups that we take care of, and do we think about being more forceful in that counseling beforehand? I don't know. It's not. It's an open question, so we'll have to think about it. I thought I'd touch on one more condition that is a little bit more specific, I think, to people of African descent. So just to give you another example. So sickle cell disease, you're probably all familiar with it. You've heard about it before. It's a condition that affects red blood cells that are in our system. So the red blood cells should be able to flow nice and freely through the arteries and the veins of our bodies. If you have sickle cell anemia, it means that the red cells get this misshapen form and that they tend to get stuck or clogged in those blood vessels. And so the hemoglobin, which is the molecule inside the red blood cells responsible for the color, responsible for carrying the oxygen, this is the entity that gets affected by the sickle cell anemia. So if we look at this at a little bit more molecular level, so this is just a little bit of science to remind us how this all works. Sickle cell anemia is caused by a point mutation, so it's a single mutation in the DNA of the individual that leads to one protein changed in the hemoglobin molecule. So you get a valine instead of glutamic acid, which means that if you look at this picture here, this is what normal hemoglobin looks like, and then sickle hemoglobin will become clumped, and then it starts to misshape the actual red blood cells. And then if you have the condition, it can cause different problems in all parts of your body because it affects, again, blood vessels. And so because we have blood vessels throughout our system, you can have effects from the eye and the retina to heart problems, pneumonias, problems within the bones. Vaso-occlusive or pain crises are episodes where the sickling content of the body becomes so high that it causes a crisis within that organ or that bone or that tissue. It causes intense pain because there's a lack of oxygen delivery in that particular area. And if we think about sickle cell anemia, this is one of the things you learn early in medical school, is that it certainly has a predisposition to African peoples and people of African descent, and it's long been postulated that the reason for this is the shape and the form of the hemoglobin, which then alters the red cell shape and function, seems to provide some resistance to malaria infection in people from these regions. So there may have been some genetic selection over the ages to help increase the frequency of sickle cell anemia mutations in people from this area. So with regard to pregnancy, so remember we talked about blood vessel effects of sickle cell anemia. There are obviously medical issues that arise, but before we even get there, there are always these conversations about genetic testing. So there are many couples who marry and happen to both be carriers of the condition, because often we marry people who are from similar backgrounds, not always, but sometimes. And so there may be an interest on the part of that couple to have testing to find out if their fetus might be affected. So some people may elect to do something called an amniocentesis to get the genetic information before the baby is born. The way it works is that if both partners are affected by the condition, then they have a 100% chance of their child developing sickle cell disease. And then the rates change depending on if one partner's a carrier and one's affected or not. Also in these regions where sickle cell mutations are common, there are other hemoglobin abnormalities such as thalassemias, which are also common, and so we look for mixed traits in couples as well. In Toronto, because it seems that there's such a high degree of mixing, we just test everyone's hemoglobin just to find out what the form is so that we understand who might have thalassemia, who might have sickle trait, or variations. So with regard to just the general medical care, if you have sickle cell disease, your red cells, they're misshapen, they get stuck. And when they get stuck, they have to be taken out of circulation. So we have cells in our body that help take those cells out of circulation. When they do that, though, they have to break down these hemoglobin molecules, and it gives off lots of iron. So you have extra iron, but not in the blood vessels. It's floating around in the system. That iron becomes toxic, and it leads to overload in different organs. So that's really what the chronic problems of sickle cell disease relate to. So this iron settles in the kidneys and the liver, heart, lungs, eyes. Everyone who has this condition gets regular eye checkups to make sure that the retinas are not trying to compensate for areas that might have lack of oxygen by overgrowth. It's called proliferative retinopathy. This happens in diabetes as well, by the way. The other thing is that they do need to have blood checkups from time to time, sometimes requiring transfusions to correct for the low blood counts, and also to find out if they've developed any antibodies, which might make transfusions in the future more complicated. So in pregnancy, there's lots of things to do and lots of things to watch out for. We see folks pretty frequently who have this condition. They get quite a few ultrasounds to watch for the baby's well-being. There's lots of attention to making sure that that these individuals avoid dehydration, whether it's from being ill or being in the heat and whatnot, because every time we get dehydrated, we're more likely to have sickling episodes take place, which can then lead to pain crises. As a result of these pain crises, which happen over and over again, many women need pain relief. And so there's quite a bit of opioid use for treating these problems, and this becomes a bit of a chronic issue for some people. So we also have to keep in mind that the baby after birth, if exposed to lots of opioids in utero, may have a kind of an abstinence or withdrawal syndrome, which requires a pediatric team to be involved. And then we have to be very careful about how we approach pain relief in labor, if that's something that she chooses to have in labor, because you have to take into account that there's already pain medication on board before you add more pain medication. So, closing thoughts. I don't know what the conclusion is here. So there's lots of medical issues. I just touched on a few, but there's a whole list of them that we could have talked about. And it's interesting, depending on what ethnic group you ask the question about, some of these conditions are very common and some are less common. I opened my green journal, so Obstetrics and Gynecology, that's the premier journal in my field. The February edition has just been released online. The lead article I opened yesterday, racial disparities in adverse pregnancy outcomes and psychosocial stress. So I could have just talked only about this article maybe. Anyway, I thought I'd share the conclusion with you. It says that among a large and geographically diverse cohort of nulliparous women, so women who haven't given birth, with singleton gestations, non-Hispanic Black women are most likely to experience preterm birth, hypertensive disease of pregnancy, and small for gestational age birth. These disparities were not materially altered for preterm birth or SGA birth by adjustments for demographic differences, and did not appear to be explained by differences in self-reported psychosocial factors. So maybe there are genetic and other medical issues at play, but I think that it's a really complicated issue that we're tackling today. I talked about sort of a little bit of it, just the clinical part that I deal with, but it's very clear that we need to think about these issues more broadly, not just in terms of socioeconomic status and access to care, but also how these disparities are so pervasive amongst our racialized groups. I'll stop there and would love to hear any comments that you might have.
Hi, my name is Remia Juanmi. I'm a registered midwife practicing in Mississauga. I don't actually know if you're the person who can answer this question, but it struck me in what you were talking about in having difficulty accessing data about racial and ethnic-based conditions in the Canadian context. And I don't know if everybody in the room is a clinician, but for those who are, you're familiar with BORN, which is the Better Outcomes Registry and Network, which collects data on all pregnant people in Ontario and breaks down all kinds of different outcomes. And taking into context what Dr. Smiley had to say about not wanting to make people who are racialized feel vulnerable about having to self-identify and the issues and the problems that having that data out there can cause for those people, why do you think it is that that data isn't available? And can we have a conversation about whether or not BORN should be collecting that data so that we're able to identify what those pockets of need are in the women or the pregnant people that we serve?
Sure. I think it's sort of like an awakening. We're just waking up to these issues now. I have a pretty good sense about why that data is maybe not available through BORN, at least not in the past. At our own hospital, where we have over 7,000 births, approximately, It was just a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that we started to collect that information or ask individuals registering in the hospital information about their ethnic background, their gender, and so on. So when I had my first child, I just checked in, got my card, my bracelet, and off I went to the labor ward. For the second one, there was a form, and the person said, "Oh, Dr. Maxwell, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to." I said, "No, I want to. So, it's a whole checklist. So, what group do you identify with? Are you white? Are you European? Are you black? Are you mixed? Or are you other?" So, I always look for the other category because it's complicated. So, look for that. But anyway, so I filled out the form. But this is a fairly recent phenomenon, and so there may be other hospitals in the area and in other parts of Canada that are further along in this. I know this is standard practice in many American hospitals because collecting this kind of data is very crucial. But I know for a fact that we only started a couple of years ago. So I don't think the data exists for most of the health problems that we would like to study in the past. But hopefully going forward, Bourne will have that information. Actually, that was in one of my conclusions, is that a Canadian perspective on pregnancy outcomes by ethnicity I think would be very helpful, because then we could address these issues in our community. I'm also not sure, when we talk about the Black community in the United States, are people of Black descent there? Is that the same as the people of Black descent here in Canada? I don't know. And the Indigenous groups, are there differences? There probably are. And so it would be helpful for us to know more about the people that we serve, the communities that we serve.
Hi, my name is Jill Wiley. I work at Bourne. And I'll just mention quickly, we have a data element called ethnicity. It's very small, includes Caucasian, Black, Asian. Some of our data is First Nations, Inuit, but I'm working in Indigenous wellness, so we're working with stakeholders to include Indigenous identifiers. But it's so limited, and the work, I think somebody's mentioned the leadership in whether it's StatCan or whether Mount Sinai's done a lot of good work, or how to create those lists, and should they be, and how long, and how to make it accessible and culturally safe to ask or to answer.
Yes.
It's a very difficult thing, but we do have that data, and lots of people request it, so it's there in its limited form.
It's great to know. Thank you. Other questions?
It's not a question, it's a statement.
Sure.
But I agree with everyone's insight about the data lack of availability. As a Master's in Public Health student, it is so hard to find information on Canadian context, so most of the time you end up using American. But recently in one of my health promotion classes, we were instructed to watch a film, Unnatural Causes. I don't know if anyone has watched that before. And they brought about a lot of good insight. They said the effect of immigrant families did not show until the second generation. So maybe an intervention could be there to help provide that support network and the cultural practices that help this, because they looked at data for Latina and also African American, and usually the ones that were first generation immigrants had great results when it comes to birth and everything of that sort, but the ones that were second generation had not so great results. So
Interesting.
Increased premature births and things of that sort. And another thing that it also looked at was it talked about African American women and how even success, so most of the time we say that social economic status, SES, has a big impact on birth weight. But then they said, okay, let's look at the women who are successful. They looked at lawyers, doctors, and things of that sort. And apparently the difference was not that big. It still showed that they still faced a greater increased chances of having a child that is premature, even though they are successful. So there's money. Money isn't the biggest thing, because when we talk about social determinants of health, the biggest thing we say it's money. There's no available resources, and it's true that is a problem. But clearly, there's something more, an underlying cause that needs to be discussed, other than just money.
Agreed.
Even though it is important, money is very important too. Yeah. All right, that's all.
Thank you for that comment. Interesting.
I was recently at a conference in the U.S. where this was really a major topic of discussion, and a lot of this data was being presented. And I think what the last person was referring to, is that as you go up income quartiles, the difference gets more dramatic. So in the highest income quartile, Black women actually have a 10 times greater maternal mortality rate than white women in that same quartile. So, yeah.
Interesting, isn't it? I had thought about including a little case study in all of this, but I decided not to. But if you, it's a very interesting read, the Vanity Fair article about Serena Williams' birth experience, and not at all what she was expecting, or probably anybody else would be expecting, particularly somebody at such a peak health fitness level. I think that these are subtleties that we need to understand better in our population, as well as in the international population. In preparing this lecture, I came across all these really interesting articles about pregnancy outcomes for couples that are of different ethnicities. So they looked at Asian and Caucasian and Black mixtures and so on. So it was all very interesting. And some of the outcomes are not what you expect. So I'll just give an example, a quick example. So if the couple are both Black, they have certain pregnancy risks. But if the couple is Black and some other race, then they have higher risks. So it's very interesting, and it's not very clear necessarily from genetic reasons why that would be. Maybe there are other factors, but just at a population level, it's all very fascinating and it's very new. And I am in the area of maternal fetal medicine. And it's news to me. Like, these are all things that I'm learning as well. So I think that we have to clearly continue the conversation. And it's been such an honor to be part of this, and I hope that I can continue to work with all of you in this area. Okay.
I'd like to thank Dr. Maxwell for such an invigorating discussion around the complications that persist among racialized women. We're moving into a break, just a 10-minute break, and then after that, we're going to continue on with our next two sessions. But before then, I just wanted to thank all of our sponsors. We've had a lot of support in trying to put this together. First of all, the Ontario Trillium Foundation for funding us and Mommy Monitor so that we could even do work like this. The Student Commissions of Canada, the University of Toronto, Dahlana, IHPME, the Black Physicians Association of Ontario, in addition to the Black History Month Committee at UHN as well, who assisted us as well in putting this all together. So, and the Black Public Health Students Collective from Dahlana as well. Thank you to all of them for all of their assistance. And yes, we'll start the break now.
All right, everyone, we're going to start back again. So we're going to reconvene again. All right, so if I can have everyone take your seats so that we can start again. There will be time during the lunch break to take a look at the amazing posters that we do have on the left-hand side of the room. No, it's not happening. All right. I tried. Can everyone take their seats, please? Can everyone take their seats, please, so we can start again? Can you take your seats, please, so we can start again? There'll be time during the break and during lunch to chat and network. Can everyone please take their seats, please, so we can start again? Let us start again. Let us start again. Let us start again. All right. So, now that I have your undivided attention, and I have also just auditioned for the launch, so I hope you decide to pick up my iTunes song. It's like at number 100 right now, but with your help, I can hopefully get to number 1. So thank you all for coming back together. Again, my name is Nikia Lifoon. I'm a PhD candidate at the Dalalana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and I'm also the VP for the Black Health Alliance, which is a non-for-profit organization that focuses on enhancing the health and well-being of African, Caribbean, and Black populations in Ontario. So we're going to get into the second half of today's conference with a speech by Anne-Marie Schroeder on maternal health challenges and care provision among LGBTQI2 communities. Anne-Marie is the founder and president of Anne-Marie Schroeder International, through which she offers her clients speaking, consultation, and workshop facilitation services to help them create equitable, not equality, but equitable and inclusive environments. Anne-Marie?
Is my mic on? Is the mic on? Is the mic on? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm not going to sing. That was awesome, but I'm not going to sing. I do other things, but singing isn't one of them. So let me just take a look at you. I haven't been here all morning, so hello, everybody. Hi. Hi. So I'm going to walk around. I'm not going to stand up here, so I hope that's okay. Ooh, now the mic is on. Yes. Fabulous. Okay. So connection is the energy that exists when we are seen, heard, and valued. Sorry, little moment there. Seen, heard, and valued. Seen, heard, and valued. Seen, heard. That's Brene Brown. So my name is Anne-Marie Schroeder, as you've heard. I want to welcome you to LGBTQI2 inclusion in birth parent healthcare. And you notice I've crossed out maternal. Yes, right? Because a language is one of the ways that LGBTQI2 folks are excluded from the get-go. So I wanted to make sure that was a change. And Elsie and I had a little conversation, so maybe, we'll see what happens with the name of the conference next year. Maybe. We'll see. I know branding is an issue. We don't have a lot of time together, and I've been asked to keep my presentation short so we can use a lot of time for the Q&A. But is it okay if I tell you a little bit about myself before I start? Yeah? Okay, so 4 things I want you to know about me. As you can see, I'm a woman of color, but what you can't see is that I'm a mom. I have a 5-year-old who's awesome, and I'm queer. And as you heard, I'm a D&I consultant, diversity and inclusion consultant. So I also want to tell you that I'm committed to fairness, belonging, and being a little goofy. So the goofy you've probably already seen. I like to bring a little bit of levity to a topic that often keeps us silent and afraid. I think we need to ask more questions so we can get to know each other more, so that we can provide the type of care that people need, right? There's a lot of things that we don't know, and we can't know because of who we are and who we're not. I also want to let you know that I'm going to be speaking about this from all those places, the D&I perspective, as a woman of color, as a queer woman of color, and as a D&I consultant. But I'm not a healthcare provider, okay? I want to be really clear about that. I'm not a healthcare provider. So we're going to be talking about care, but I don't have that expertise. I'm not coming from that place, all right? So here's my goal. Oh, technology, fun. Here's my goal for today. Here are my goals for today. My intentions for today is to leave you with more questions than you came with. And you're like, that's not fair. But, we're learning, and we continue to learn, and we need to make sure that we're challenging ourselves to do that. That you commit to seeing more of who you are as a care provider, and more of who other people are that are coming in for care that you're working with. And that you pursue greater awareness in that capacity so that you can serve LGBTQI2 folks to the best of your ability. And that will continue to evolve as you learn and you grow, right? I also want to tell you that, sorry, I've had a sick kid at home for the last 2 days, so I need my notes. Also want to tell you that I usually use LGBTQ. So if I forget the I2, it's not because I've forgotten them in my mind, it's that I'm used to using a shorter acronym, but I will endeavor to use both. So we know that when we do LGBT inclusion in schools, research shows us that when we do LGBT inclusion, everybody benefits. And I'm not really sure why that is, but my guess is that because LGBTQ folks are also racialized, are also people with disabilities, are also people from different religions, different cultures, right? We're not always visible just as LGBTQ folks. So I think that's why that is. So what I'm going to do today is tell you my story, give you some things to think about, provoke some questions, answer some questions, and at the end, because we have a very short time together today, I'll tell you a little bit about how you can keep in touch with me, how you can keep this on your radar, how you might be able to learn more. Okay? Fair? Yeah? Awesome. So we're talking about birth-parent health, or maternal health, as you will more likely see out there, right, in classes or in literature or in posters. So when you think about, just close your eyes, when you think about birth-parent health, when you think about maternal health, what's the image that pops into your mind? I'm guessing it might be something like that. Or maybe with a partner. We live in a world, in a society that we see mostly the dominant culture narrative, right? So in this case, we're talking about a racialized health conference. We're going to see people who are white. And unconscious bias helps us to perpetuate that. Maybe because you're here today, you might be thinking this. Or maybe with a partner, like that. Or maybe because we're doing this particular session, you might think about this. Now, this is where I have to start apologizing for stock photography. And if you've ever looked for pictures, you'll know that when you're looking for racialized, the numbers drop. And if you're looking for queer and racialized, there's like hardly any. So my apologies, but I'm hoping that you'll get what I mean. Or maybe this. But what about this? So this is from the newspaper. Screenshot. Oh my gosh, I'm like clicking you all the way through. I should put this down. So what about that? What about trans men who give birth? What about genderqueer individuals who give birth? What about intersex individuals who we may not recognize, right? Who give birth. So we need to expand what we think about when we think about who's pregnant and who the birth parent is and what that looks like. And also who their partners are, because we're not just working with one person necessarily. If they're a single parent, we might be, but if they're not a single parent, then we also have to take into consideration who their partner is and create an environment that's respectful and acknowledging of that person as well. I know people in the room. So what I want to suggest to you today, and I'm sure you've thought about this in many different ways and many times before, is that your work with each of these clients is going to be very similar. But it's also going to be very different depending on who they are, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that might look like from an LGBTQI2 perspective today. So I want you to consider this. You already saw this slide, but when belonging happens, magic happens. When belonging happens, magic happens. Can you say that with me for a second? When belonging happens, magic happens. And it's true. When we see each other, then all sorts of amazing things can happen. But we're busy, and we're stressed, and we have a whole bunch of clients on our list of people to see that day, and sometimes we forget about the magic. So, as you know from maybe personal experience and from your work that you do, pregnancy is one of like the most magical, terrifying, vulnerable, obscure times in a person's life, right? And you might be feeling any number of things. You might be scared, you might be excited, you might be sick, you might be angry, you might be giddy, you might be sad, you might be all those things at the same time when you're pregnant. And you want someone, especially if it's your first time, to really care about you. You want them to maybe hold your hand. You want them to let you know that everything's going to be okay. What you don't want to do is be worrying about if you're going to be respected or safe. Right? So that's a reality for LGBTQI2 folks. And much like people of color, racialized individuals, we can't always be sure that we're going to be respected or safe in a situation. The difference is that sometimes we can fly below the radar, right? Can't hide the color of your skin, but I can hide my queerness, depending on how I dress or who I'm with maybe, right? Challenge is that if I don't show up as queer, then you might not know that I'm queer. And I'm not going to tell you I'm queer if it's not safe for me to tell you I'm queer. And then there's going to be a dance. Either you're not going to get, I'm not going to get the care that I need, and you're not going to see who I am, and that there's going to be this weird dance that happens. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. This is me. When I was pregnant. So much fun, and not in a lot of ways. But I was clear when I was pregnant that I wanted a midwife, and I was clear that I wanted a home birth. And I was also clear that it was really, really important for me to find a care provider, a midwife, and a clinic where I was going to be able to show up, where I was going to be able to be a queer woman of color, and where my partner, who at the time was a black woman, no, sorry, she's still a black woman. We're no longer partners. My partner at the time, who is a black woman, I also wanted to make sure that she felt comfortable, that she felt seen and acknowledged. What does that look like in the context of prenatal care? What it looked like to me was that we would both be acknowledged in the appointments, that we would both be able to answer questions, that if we had to talk about the known donor that we have, that would be something that we could talk about and not feel weird about, that if we that we would both be able to answer questions, that if questions were asked about any of those things, that they would be respectful, that they would have a context, that the person that was talking to us would have an awareness that they're bringing to those questions, how they ask them, if they ask them to us, or if they can get the answers from somebody else. All that was really important to me and to my partner. Now, I ended up in the hospital, so what I wanted to make sure then was, and I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but in advance, I wanted to make sure that my partner was going to be recognized at the hospital, that they were going to know who she was, that she was going to be treated as a parent, and that when the known donor showed up, that they were going to know who he was, and there wasn't going to be this weird, okay, now who's this now, right? All that was important to me. And so I was very, very careful about where I went for care. Now, sometimes we don't have a choice about where we go for care. I happened to have lucked out, and I had an amazing experience. So some partners may want to breastfeed. If you're scratching your head now, that some partners may want to breastfeed. So how do we facilitate that? How do we talk about that? Do we bring it up? Do we wait for them to bring it up? If you bring it up, it's on your radar. The person can relax. It's not going to be weird. They're not going to look at me like I have two heads, right? These are things when we provide the opportunity for people to be who they are by the opportunities that we give them through what we ask or what we say or what we offer, right? We can relax. And we can show up as who we are. Having a midwife also meant that somebody was going to be coming into our home. That's a really vulnerable space, right? Really vulnerable space. I didn't want somebody who's going to raise their eyebrows and have weird looks and ask strange questions about our one bedroom or the books on our shelves or our lifestyle, right? I wanted to make sure that my home was going to be a safe place. So these are things that we shouldn't have to that we should be able to take for granted. But often, as people from marginalized communities, we can't take these things for granted. What do we do in order to find care that's respectful and relevant and meaningful? What do we do when we're from marginalized groups? How do we find that care? This is the interactive part. What do we do? How do we find it? Ask friends. What else? That's it. Sorry? The web, right? We can look for reviews, but usually we ask friends, or we go somewhere that we already know, in this case is LGBTQI2 inclusive, and we ask them if they know where we can go. We might go to the 519, or we might go to the Sherburne Health Center, or we might go to the LGBT Parenting Network and say, hey, I'm pregnant, or I'm thinking of getting pregnant. Where can I go that's going to be safe, where I'm going to get care that's respectful, that's going to see me, where I'm going to be able to relax and just do me and do this pregnancy thing and have a good experience. So we know that discrimination doesn't always announce itself in a big event, right? We know that discrimination happens in lots of little ways: small comments, disrespectful questions, tiny facial expressions, and silence. And what are the ramifications of that? First of all, when you're pregnant, you don't want to deal with this. You don't want to deal with this anytime. But when you're pregnant, during this magical time for some of us, you don't want to deal with that. And personally, I had what we lovingly called progester rage. So I would have taken anybody out. But that's not what you want to be worried about. You don't want to be worried about respectful, safe environment and care, being treated respectfully by your care provider. That's not what you want. What are the implications of that? The implication of that is I may not ask the questions that I need to ask. I may not get the information that I need. I may not be able to take care of myself in as good a way as I can. Wow, that was really bad grammar. And you may not get the answers that you need. You may not get the information that you need because I might not show up. I don't know if I want to say that. Oh, what's going to happen if I say that? Maybe I should not say that. And then we do this dance where I don't get the care that I need and you don't get to provide the care that you can to the best of your ability. All right. So that's where my story ends, because as a queer woman, I had it easy in some ways. 5 minutes! Okay, I'm almost done. I had it easy in some ways, right? There are lots of people, subtle I am not. There are lots of people on the LGBTQI2 spectrum who have greater barriers than I experienced, right? And so I can't talk about their experience. I can talk about experience I've heard from my friends, from other people, from things I've read, and from my training. And we'll go through some of those together. But, first of all, my gender expression tells you that I'm female most of the time. I'm cisgender, right? Trans folks can transition through changing their gender expression, changing their name, and maybe through surgery. Then we have folks who are genderqueer who are sort of not on either end of the male or female spectrum, who are fluid. And we have intersex folks, right? Those are not my experiences, the bottom ones. So there's other things that we need to take into consideration and be more aware of in those situations. So let's do a little journey together, shall we? If you feel comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes. And if you don't feel comfortable, just follow along with me, okay? So consider you are genderqueer, somebody whose gender expression, their clothing, their hairstyle, etc., doesn't provide gender markers, and you're pregnant. What if you're a trans man and you're pregnant? Now, I want you to consider walking into a midwifery clinic or an OB office for your first appointment. You walk in, the receptionist is busy, you get to the desk, they look up, and what's the rest of the story that plays out in your mind? Is there awkwardness? Silence? Is there question marks hanging in the air? Hopefully there's no disrespect overt, but that can happen as well. Is there fumbling over a person's name? Is there navigating a health card that maybe has a different looking picture, or a different gender marker on it? What about what pronouns to use? Do you use she, he, they, Z, something else? What's this receptionist, what kind of service is this receptionist providing for this person? And we haven't even left the waiting room yet. Then you have to go into the office and talk about and show parts of your body. And for some of you, you may resonate with resistance or anxiety or fear or shame about showing your body for all sorts of reasons. But what if the person in front of you, what if your client is intersex or trans and doesn't have a body that looks like it, quote unquote, should? How do you create an environment that's safe? What about the unspoken questions that may be hanging in the air? Or what if those questions are questions that somebody asks you and they're not appropriate, or they make you uncomfortable, or you wish they would have asked somebody else? When I was pregnant and I walked into the midwifery clinic, there was no question about who I was or why I was there. But that's not the case for a lot of people in the LGBTQI2 community. So we need to be ready. So you can open your eyes now. I'm going to speed through the rest of it. So there's things that you might need to know about hormones and the impact of hormones, surgeries and the impact of surgeries, anatomy, right? That you need to know ahead of time before folks come into your practice. You don't whip out that when you realize that somebody is LGBTQI2. You know it. It's part of what you do all the time. It's part of how you do your practice all the time, because then when somebody walks into your office, you're ready, and they get it, and they can feel it, and they know that they're safe, and you proceed with your care. And if these are things that you don't know about, or you need to know more about, then that's part of our learning curve, right? And it's not just birth parents we have to think about, it's their partners as well, right? Because your client might be part of the LGBTQI2 community or not, or their partner may be part of the LGBTQI2 community or not. And everybody needs to know that you're respectful and that you understand where they're coming from, right? That you understand their realities and their stories. So where do you start? First, I want to tell you that inclusion is an outcome. Inclusion of any kind, in this case we're talking about LGBTQ inclusion, doesn't happen because you focus on it. It happens because you do a whole bunch of other things and you get there. And those other things that you do are the ABCs, I like to call them: awareness, belonging, community. Most of what I've suggested to you today is the awareness piece, all right? But there's other parts that you can find out about in my white paper. I don't know why they call it a white paper. But anyways, I have one of those called The Future of Inclusion, so I'll let you know how you can get that if you want to know more. But some parts of awareness include language, terms and definitions, and lived experiences and realities. So what language are you using? The fact that we've crossed out maternal and put birth parent is an example of that language. The fact that you would likely use partner instead of husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend is an example of language that's inclusive, that lets people know, oh, maybe it's safe here. And for marginalized communities, we look for clues. Is it safe? Is this a respectful place? So language is one of those first clues. Terms and definitions. Do you know what the L, the G, the B, the 2, the Q, the I, and all the other letters that sometimes you might see, do you know what they are? And do you know what they mean? Do you know how to use them appropriately, when to use them appropriately? And can you help someone who isn't using them appropriately? Because that's also part of creating that space. And then lived experiences and realities. You may not have the lived experience, but find out, what does it mean to transition from female to male? What does it mean to be genderqueer? What does it mean to be intersex? And what knowledge do you need so that you're providing respectful and safe care and medically accurate care? All of that's important. So the B is about belonging, getting to know people, asking questions, creating a sense of belonging, and the C is about building community. When you let people know that you're LGBTQI2 inclusive, when you build a community around that. And it's not about the flag, right? The flag is great, but it's not an internationally recognized symbol, and we have people here from all over the world. It's also something that suggests that you're doing the work. Not that you're going to do the work, not that you'd like to do the work, but that when I walk through the door, I'm good. So I always tell people it's the last thing that goes up if you're going to use it. Last thing after you've done all the training and you've really worked at it. It's the last thing that goes up. So that's it for today. Where's Elsie? She's gone. She held up the 5 minutes and she left the room. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I told you I'd let you know how you could keep in touch with me. So hopefully I've hit the intentions, more questions, committing to seeing more, and that you're going to pursue greater awareness. And there's lots of different places and ways that you can do that. One of the ways you can do that is to sign up for my weekly inclusion insight. Every Monday you get an email in your inbox with a little food for thought and a little challenge to keep inclusion on your radar. Or I've just put together an e-course about this topic. So you'll find this form in your conference package. And if you want to fill it out and give it to me at lunchtime, I'd be happy to take it and sign you up for whatever you want to sign up for. If you don't catch me at lunchtime, you can still send me an email. Here's my email address. And I'm offering a discount till midnight tonight if you want to take the e-course. So have no fear. If you don't get the sheet, you can always just pop me an email and I'll hook you up. So what happens when belonging happens? Magic happens. All right. So that's it. Now we get to do some Q&A, apparently. How did I do? Perfect, yeah. It's now been 7 minutes, but I'm not going to tell you that. It's all good. Okay. Where am I going to stand? I guess I'll stand here.
If you have any questions, we invite you guys to kind of just walk up to the microphone and give mine, and then she'll ask them as they ask.
Any questions? No questions? Hi.
Hi. My only question is more of a discussion.
Yeah, let's discuss.
I find it interesting in our health. So we do a training, and so we use genderless language and
Great.
inclusive language for the whole program. And it's interesting that the feedback that we get in our industry is that it's very split because of the ratio of like women and motherhood.
Right.
Inclusive language. So I would just love, I mean, I know because within this group it's probably just so you could speak to how we can be providing this great care when there is a huge resistance among birth workers around the ratio of cis women.
Well, I'll give you my opinion. Like I said, I'm not in healthcare, but you know, when somebody walks into your office and sits down and you're developing a relationship with them, and they're cis female, you can call them a mom. It's okay, right? Or if they're queer and they're female identified, you can call them a mom. It's fine. But what we're doing when we expand our language is letting everyone know that they're welcome. And you're not going to call the trans man who's pregnant in your office a mom. You're not going to do it, right? Or the genderqueer individual who doesn't identify as female, a mom. So expand your language so that when people come to see you, they know that it's safe. And just like you might use their last name when you first meet and then their first name after the second or third appointment or whatever, adjust your language. We always let people identify themselves. And when we know how they identify, then we can use that terminology if there's a terminology we need to use, or we use those pronouns, whatever. We always let them lead, right? So I'm not suggesting you walk around saying birth parent, birth parent, birth parent for the whole time with every single person. But you need to open, and language is a huge marker for inclusion. Of course, you have to follow it with how you treat people. It's not the only marker for inclusion, right? But, so, does that answer your question? Food for thought. Hi.
Hi, I'm just going to respond a little bit to that.
Please.
Some people in this room know me. My name is Katrina Kilwer. I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Midwives. And I would challenge the comment that there's a huge, don't know the words you exactly said, a huge number, or a huge resistance to, or a huge number of people ascribing to this idea that being respectful and inclusive of other people's human rights somehow erases the rights of women. We've had this dialogue in the Canadian Association of Midwives, and I would say that group is not huge, they're just loud.
Yeah.
And I think you can do the work within the doula community. There is a statement on trans inclusivity and human rights from the Canadian Association of Midwives and many others in the birth workers community that could help inform that dialogue for doulas. And it's critically important that we see this from a human rights perspective.
Thank you. It's really important. And resistance is usually loud. So then, you know, what do? Just like, okay, we won't do it. No. It's a human rights issue. We do it. And we educate and we talk about and we help people understand why it's important. Any other questions? Comments? Come on down. You're welcome.
I'm hoping that I can quote you in a webinar that I'm putting on next week. But
depends on what you're going to quote me on. Which part?
For many of us, I'm Carlene Wilson-Mitchell and I teach at Ryerson University. And for many of our students, and particularly after our two presenters this morning shared that people don't necessarily want to be called out. They don't know if it's a safe space for them to identify their many identities.
Yeah.
So they're feeling out the waters. And many of our students ask, you know, when we're asked to fill out this antenatal record, we're not quite sure how to bring up the question of how do you want to be identified or what's important to you. For the many students here in the room, can you give us some suggestions? What made you feel safe and as though you belonged? Not only when you passed the front desk and came into care, but as you were being asked the history and they were going through all the questions in the antenatal record. And as you say, you know, someone may not necessarily by their dress or by how they present themselves be a person that you can label.
Right.
You know, and I'm using that in quotation quotation marks.
Absolutely.
How would you give them advice, and how would you give us advice as educators on how to teach them how to make the room a safe space to even answer those kinds of questions that help us to provide the care that's needed?
Right, okay.
Individualized.
Whew, that's a big question. So first of all, my daughter's 5, and how many of you have been pregnant? Okay, so I have no memory. I don't remember that first appointment, but I'll tell you some of the things that I can think about, and some of the things that I teach about, right? So visual cues are huge. When you walk into an office, visual cues include things like what kind of pictures are on the wall, what language is on your forms, what language is in your brochures, what language is in your website. So if you have birth parent on there, if you have we are LGBTQI2 inclusive, that's language. I know when I walked into the midwifery clinic, there were pictures on the wall, right? And the midwives had a little picture of themselves and a little bio. So some of the midwives identified as queer. Woo! So I was like, okay, good. And that was also on the website, so I already knew about that when I walked in. What do your forms say? Do they say gender, male, female, check, check? Or do they say gender, space, for people to fill in? That's a clue, right? And then, I think we get all bent out of shape about how do we ask people how they identify. Well, you ask people how they identify. Right? If I come in with my partner, you may have a clue, you may not. But if you start your conversation with, we are an inclusive clinic, we're an inclusive practice. In order for me to serve you to the best of my abilities, I'd like to know how you identify. What pronoun would you like me to use? Right? Is there anything else you'd like me to, right? And as you go through the form, there's questions that you can ask that are more specific. Right? How would you like me to address you? Is there anything else you want to tell me about your, what's it like for you to be pregnant? How you ask the questions is just as important as what you're going to ask, right? The manner in which you ask. Inclusion is about the what, but it's also about the how. Your tone, how open and welcoming you are. Is there a baby coming? Maybe. So the visual cues and the language cues will help people because we're looking, right? We come into a room and we look. If you have staff on your team that are queer and that identify as queer and that are visibly queer, whatever that means for them, that will help. And people talk. So I knew what clinics I wanted to check out because I asked. So you already have an entry point. But then it's every individual in that clinic is different. And so I want to make sure that I'm safe with that person and with this person. Your bathrooms. What do your bathrooms say on them? Right? So sorry I can't be more specific because I don't remember my experience, but those are some of the things that we work. Yeah. Oh yeah, the poster with the rainbow. Rip up the poster with the rainbow. Seriously, rip it up and do the work. Have the conversations. And then, maybe in a year, then you can think about putting up the poster with the rainbow. Seriously. Because we use the rainbow as this little thing we hide behind. Oh, we're going to put the rainbow up. Everybody think we're so cool. And you haven't done the work. You have to know how to answer questions. You have to be comfortable in that situation. You have to be okay with saying, wow, I never thought of that. Imagine if you said, wow, I never thought of that. I'll get back to you. I'm really sorry, I never thought of that. I am not you. I am not LGBTQI. I don't know. Let me get back to you. Hooray! Right? We're human. You don't have to know everything, but you need to know that there's things that you're not going to catch, won't know, can't know because of who you are, and be willing to say that and find out. Bring somebody else into the room or, Google it and have a conversation with a few people so that the next time the person comes in, right? Or if they're willing to share with you and talk to you about their experience and help you understand better, great. But it's not their job to educate you. Right? It's not our job to educate. Did I tell you about the focus groups? Did I miss that part? So I did focus groups this summer with genderqueer and trans folks around community and inclusion. And consistently, every time what came up with how exhausting it is to advocate for healthcare and how exhausting it is to have to educate your healthcare provider. Wow. When you walk into a room to get healthcare, you shouldn't have to educate your healthcare provider about what it means to be trans or what it means to be intersex, right? That's not your job. You're there to get health care. They should know that. And if they don't, they should be willing to find out. It's not our job to educate our healthcare providers. That's my rant. Okay. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
that. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. I'm not sick. So I will not be spreading it to you, I promise. But I wanted to, it actually ties into what you just said, and just to foreground that. So I'm an HIV and infectious disease provider, and mostly here because I'm really interested in issues of racialized maternal health, and also have the experience of that in the past and currently. And I actually was just coming up to comment on that piece, that in my other parts of my job, right, particularly within medical education and medical institutions, we expect people to do the work, right? We expect that labor to happen on the backs of racialized people, people who identify as LGBTQI2, right? We expect them to teach us. And one of the things that I've found most important and transformative is actually us doing the work ourselves, not just with our patients or our clients, but with each other, right? So when you're sitting in case conferences, at least for me, and I have to say that, midwifery is miles ahead of traditional, academic ivory tower, medicine.
That's
and
good
so
to know.
I think we have a lot to learn from our midwifery colleagues. But when I'm sitting in a case conference and people keep misgendering someone, right, or using the wrong pronouns, actually taking my privilege and sitting in that space and saying, actually, they prefer they, or correcting that, or highlighting that as something that needs to be changed and that we're all respectful of.
Right.
And I think that for me, that's been part of that learning curve over the last several years. Is it's not enough to necessarily do it just with the client or with the patient, which we should all be doing and still need to be doing a better job of, but doing it within our institutions, because that's, I think, one of the most important ways to actually engender a culture shift.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so, we're talking about client care, patient care, but LGBT inclusion benefits the people who work in your office. Because guess what? Some of those people might be LGBTQI2 as well, right? So when you start talking about LGBTQI2 inclusion, your colleagues will feel more comfortable to speak up if they don't already. Your colleagues may come out if they haven't already, right? And then you have access to a wealth of information around the table with you, and people will feel more comfortable, hopefully, if you're doing it well. Your colleagues will feel more comfortable. You may have volunteers, you may have students, right? Will feel more comfortable say, well, actually, by the way, how about this? Or actually, in my experience, how about this? Or you didn't think about this. So we don't just do inclusion for the people that walk through our door as clients. We do inclusion for ourselves. We do inclusion for the people we work with. And we're also instructing other clients who are not LGBTQI2 about how they need to, I'm going to use the word behave, it's not my favorite word, but how they need to behave in your practice. How they need to treat other clients in the waiting room. How they need to treat your staff. 0! No more questions, we're done.
So we have
We're done.
for just one brief question.
One brief question, okay.
You may not be able to answer, but I'm Cassandra Bache, and I'm a fertility coach, but I'm also a single mother by choice.
Yay!
And thank you. And when I was going to the fertility clinic, the medical doctor said, now next time you have to come with your husband.
Oh, right,
and of
yeah.
course, it said it on my file and everything. The other doctor there was absolutely mortified.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, it seems like there are discussions on so many levels about, racial issues and gender and all of these things, but nobody's really talking about single mothers by choice, or at least that's my observation, and yet we're absolutely a growing demographic.
Absolutely.
And I just wondered if anyone in the room is aware of discussions like this going on for single mothers by choice or about single mothers by choice, and just anybody's thoughts on it. So that's my question.
Great. Yeah, and you could be a queer single mother by choice or
Sure.
a not queer single
Of
mother by
course.
choice, right? And I was a single mother by choice when I started my journey and was totally stealth at the fertility clinic, except with my doctor, who shall remain nameless. And I had a known donor. And so sometimes we pretended,
Right.
and sometimes I was just me by myself. So yeah, do you have a partner, right? Not who's your partner. Not when's your husband coming, not who's your boyfriend. Do you have a partner? Are you doing this alone? That's an opening for someone to share who they are with you, right? Questions should allow people to open. That's the hope. Thank you for that.
presentation and for leading the discussion. I know I hate to cut it off, but we have a full day ahead of us, and hopefully Anne-Marie will be here she'll be here at lunch, so if you have any questions, comments, please feel free to find her and bug her, and yeah, thank you very much. So, I mean, Anne-Marie said a lot of amazing things, particularly around inclusion, right? So not just putting up the flag, but also making sure at every step of the way that you actually have someone and you have people there that have the abilities to provide inclusionary services. So expanding upon inclusion when it comes to maternal health, next up we have Leslie Tarasoff. So she'll be speaking about maternal health challenges and care provision among people with disabilities. Leslie is a PhD candidate at my school, the Dalhousie School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. And her doctoral research explores how women with physical disabilities experience the perinatal period and early motherhood. Leslie?
Different setup than I'm used to. So like Nakia said, I am just finishing up my PhD in public health at U of T, and I'm going to be talking about some of my PhD research and also kind of the broader landscape of perinatal or maternal health research in the area of disability, and my work specifically focuses on physical disability. So I just want to start off my presentation by acknowledging some people because my work wouldn't be possible without funding, without my supervisory committee, and most importantly, the participants of my research. So I want to start off by talking about who are women with physical disabilities, especially in Canada. So I think a lot of what's been talked about this morning, there's a lot of parallels with my work. So for example, Dr. Jackson Best talked about who is left out. So when we think about maternity care for women in Canada, who do we think about? And Anne-Marie kind of had that exercise, close your eyes. And when you imagine a pregnant woman or a mother, often we do not think about women with disabilities, especially women with physical disabilities. So I just kind of want to give a picture of who these women are in Canada. So generally, across most age groups, there's more women with disabilities in Canada than there are men, and disabilities related to pain, flexibility, and mobility are most common. Recent data from Statistics Canada, this is the language that they use, so racialized women are less likely to be disabled, but there's higher proportions of disability among Indigenous women in Canada, and that's pretty recent data. We also know in Canada that women with disabilities are less likely to be highly educated, have lower socioeconomic status, more likely to live alone, and to be lone parents. And we also know, at least data from the United States, that child-rearing women with disabilities are at increased risk for physical and mental health outcomes, negative health outcomes. So this might be mental health issues around substance use and depression, or just poor health status. So what I'm going to be talking about today, most of my talk's going to focus on care experiences, but I want to talk about outcomes too, because I think there might be some clinicians in the room who might want to know more about this. But I think what a lot of people have been talking about today is how to provide more inclusive care spaces. So we know from the literature that women with physical disabilities are becoming pregnant and give birth at similar rates to non-disabled women. So this is research coming out of the United States. In Canada, we don't know the rates, but in the United States, researchers have found this. However, we know from research that I've done, that other researchers in Canada, the US, Europe, Australia, New Zealand have done, that women with physical disabilities encounter numerous barriers to prenatal care, including inaccessible care settings. So places where there aren't accessible washrooms, adjustable tables, adjustable exam tables or beds, attitudinal barriers, so negative attitudes from healthcare providers or just the general population, and also informational barriers. So not only do women with physical disabilities themselves have a hard time finding information about the intersection of pregnancy and disability, but healthcare providers also do not know a lot about this. I'm just going to grab my tea because I feel like my mouth's really dry. Right. So what I'm showing here are outcomes mostly based on American data, and in Canada we have very little population-based data on the pregnancy and birth outcomes of women with physical disabilities. And this kind of speaks to the point that was brought up about born and which different demographics or information is included in administrative data sets or population-based data sets. So for example, in Canada, it's a bit old now, but the Maternity Experiences Survey did not include any information or ask about disability status. So we don't know a lot about women with physical disabilities, maternity care experiences in Canada. And conversely, the Statistics Canada has the Canadian Survey on Disability, and they ask a lot of things about people with disability, about their education, their employment, kind of things that they kind of do in the public life, if they use an assistive device, things like that. But there's no questions on that survey about sexual and reproductive health. So again, there's a lot of data gaps around sexual and reproductive health of people with disabilities in Canada. So what we do know from some of the American population-based data is that women with physical disabilities are less likely to receive prenatal care in the first trimester. They're more likely to have preterm birth and low birth weight babies, and more likely to have cesarean delivery. There's a lot of limitations with this data, however, because some or many of the population-based studies do not stratify by physical disability type. So this is women with disabilities, physical disabilities grouped together. And one thing that we also don't know is why cesarean rates are so high. Is this directly related to disability, or do these have to do with factors about healthcare providers' attitudes or the healthcare system? So this is an area that we don't know enough about. So I'm briefly going to talk about my dissertation study, and for that study I had many objectives. Many of them are theoretical and I'm not going to talk about today, but really I wanted to better understand women with physical disabilities healthcare, prenatal healthcare experiences here in Ontario, and to identify barriers to care. So things that they identified as challenging to accessing care and just their care journey. So my study was a small qualitative study. I interviewed 13 mothers with physical disabilities in Ontario, and all of them had given birth within the last 5 years of when I interviewed them, and quite a few of them had actually given birth within the last year, and one in the last 6 weeks. So their experiences were very fresh. And most of the women resided in the GTA, and I really tried to get women of diverse races and sexual orientations and women in rural areas, but I found it really hard to find participants for my study, so I only ended up with 13, but I interviewed most of them twice, so I got a very rich data set. So this is the breakdown of who my participants are. So most of them, you can see, they all had a physical disability, but the types really varied. So because my study is a qualitative study, it's not representative of all women with physical disabilities in Ontario, but this kind of gives a sense of who participated. So there are 4 women with cerebral palsy, some had spinal cord injuries, there are 4 in the age range of 30 to 34. Most of them used an assistive device, so a wheelchair, a motorized scooter, a cane, crutches. Many of them, in addition to their mobility or functional limitations, many of them talked about experiencing chronic pain. And this is something that I found is not talked a lot about in the literature. So yes, there's challenges related to mobility and function, but chronic pain is often something that healthcare providers don't acknowledge or take seriously or know how to manage. So that's something that came out a lot in my study. And again, my participants varied in terms of the type of disability that they had, but in terms of other sociodemographics, they were pretty homogenous. So only one participant identified as racialized, only one identified as queer. Most of them were married or partnered, and most of them lived in larger urban centers and had higher SES or high levels of education. I think 6 out of my 13 participants had a graduate degree. So they're not necessarily representative of women with physical disabilities as a population. And I think that's some interesting data to think about. This is something I'm thinking about in writing my dissertation, this idea of what I've called reproductive privilege. So women with disabilities experience many types of marginalization and oppression because of their disability status, but how come some women with disabilities are becoming mothers and maybe some aren't? What might be preventing some women from having this experience? So in terms of the outcomes of my participants, I didn't ask them so much about more clinical outcomes, but in terms of the type of birth they had, many of them had cesarean deliveries, but not all of those felt that route of delivery was wanted or planned. So some of them had unplanned cesarean deliveries, and they noted a bunch of some outcomes as a result of that, some poor outcomes. Many had more than one child, and most had an obstetrician as their main care provider. Only 2 participants had a midwife as their care provider. In terms of other types of support around pregnancy and birth and breastfeeding, so 3 of my participants reported that they had a pregnancy or delivery or birth doula, and 4 participants talked about how they had a postpartum doula or a lactation consultant. 5 of my participants reported that their baby had spent some time in the NICU. The main reason for this was medication withdrawal. So participants, for various reasons, for managing disability-related symptoms, had to take medication, and this impacted their infants. So what I mostly want to focus my talk on today is care experiences, and these are 5 of the themes that I identified from the narratives of participants that I interviewed. So they talked about care spaces being inaccessible, they talked about encountering negative attitudes, they talked about a lack of information and knowledge, and these are things, as I mentioned, already identified in the literature. They also talked about a lack of communication and collaboration among different types of providers, so between maternal health providers or obstetrics and rheumatology or disability-related healthcare providers. And finally, I want to talk about the misunderstandings of disability and disability-related health needs that they identified, because I think that really ties together all of these barriers that they identified. So I have some quotes here because I feel like it's best to put the voices of my participants forward because it's their experiences. So as I mentioned, many participants talked about healthcare settings being inaccessible. And this wasn't just washrooms, so this is an example. And I won't say which hospital in Toronto this is. But this is an example of something I think that's a pretty easy fix, and you would think all hospitals would have accessible washrooms on every floor. But participants also talked about tables and examination beds that didn't adjust and things like that. Another thing that participants mentioned were negative attitudes that they encountered. So again, this has to do with accessibility, but also just a lack of understanding and knowledge, I think, about disability, or a lot of assumptions made about disability. So participants talked about, not being treated very well because it took them longer to do things and they weren't getting the support that they needed. Some participants talked about not really being recognized as pregnant. So one participant with cerebral palsy who uses a motorized scooter, talked about how she went in and had her appointment with her obstetrician, and then when she went out to talk to the receptionist to book the next appointment, the receptionist whispered to the doctor, "She's not pregnant, is she?" Sort of assuming or not recognizing her as a disabled body who could also be a pregnant body. And most participants talked about how their main care provider, usually their obstetrician, was pretty good around the attitude stuff, but many participants talked about the nurses and other allied healthcare professionals who had negative attitudes. So one participant talked about how the nurses treated her like she shouldn't be having children. Another thing that participants talked about was themselves having a hard time accessing information and knowledge about pregnancy and disability and how their pregnancy might affect the progression of their disability or how disability might affect pregnancy. And one participant talked about how her care team was pretty excited that she was there. This is a participant who's quadriplegic, and everyone was excited that she was the first patient having a disability like this at the hospital, but a lot of people didn't really know what was going on. So she talked about her experience kind of being like a big experiment. Again, participants talked about having to educate their providers. So what Anne-Marie said, it's a lot of labor for marginalized populations to have to constantly educate their healthcare providers, and they shouldn't be doing this, but many participants talked about their care experiences in this way. So how their healthcare providers didn't necessarily have more information than they did, so that was really frustrating. And on top of, being excited and anxious about being pregnant for the first time, but how those anxieties can be heightened when there's just so little information. And one thing that I mentioned about participants having babies in the NICU is one area that some talked about unknowns was around medication. So participants wanted to know more about how the medication they were taking might interact with their pregnancy and birth and their fetus, but providers didn't always have answers. So there was a lot of unknowns, especially around management of medication, specifically as it related to pain. A number of participants who had complex medical conditions also talked about the lack of communication and collaboration among perinatal or maternal healthcare providers and their disability-related healthcare providers. And they felt that if their providers had communicated more, some negative outcomes could have been avoided. So participants talked about the siloing of the medical community. And I realized that in not every city or community that all kinds of healthcare providers can, work together in a single site. But I think there's a long way to go in terms of different types of providers communicating with one another. So participants talked about there not being a lot of collaboration or communication, and then something would happen or go wrong or accelerate some sort of intervention, and there was just a flurry of activity to do damage control after the fact. So that was really frustrating for participants, especially since many had been born with their disability or acquired it at a young age, and so they had a lot of interaction with the healthcare system or with disability-related providers who knew them and knew their bodies and felt that if their perinatal or maternal providers would have communicated with their disability-related providers, some things could have been improved in terms of their care and outcomes. And finally, I think all of what I've been talking about today really gets down to this crux of misunderstandings about disability or assumptions about women and people with disabilities. So some participants talked about how they felt that their disability-related concerns were dismissed, like, oh, you'll figure it out. And they were like, no, I don't know if I can figure this out on my own. I want help, I want information. And that was kind of like dismissed. And, after, especially concerns were dismissed around breastfeeding support and parenting support. So there was a major focus on, getting through the pregnancy and birth, and then you're kind of on your own after that. One participant talked about how her specific disability or medical condition wasn't really considered. So this participant had muscular dystrophy, and she was talking to her doctor, and her doctor had wrote down MS. So just total disregard for her specific condition, and we know there's differences in disabilities. It's not just physical disabilities as a wide umbrella. People or participants also talked about how they were talked about, but not to. So people would talk about you and your disability without actually talking to you about it. So people would make, their healthcare providers would make decisions without asking them what might work best for them and what might work best for them in terms of how they knew their body. And this kind of, this attention was often the wrong kind of attention. So it's either a dismissal of disability-related needs or kind of an overemphasis on some things related to disability that weren't necessarily relevant. So as I mentioned, a lot of participants talked about issues with chronic pain. So sometimes their healthcare provider would really be concerned with them falling and kind of mobility functional issues, where they were really concerned with chronic pain and didn't feel like that issue was taken up adequately. So what I found from talking with women with physical disabilities is one of the underlying issues that makes it hard for them to access adequate prenatal care is that in our current system, the pregnant body is assumed to be a non-disabled body. And I think this is an assumption if we think about ideas and discourses of who a mother is or a good mother is. So often, a mother is not imagined to be queer or to be Black or to be disabled. And so this idea of who a parent is or who a mother is needs to be expanded, and that needs to be re-examined in education around maternal health, in clinical practice, and just in general society. So when we think about who a mother is or who can be pregnant, we need to expand our idea of which bodies can do that. So this is all really negative, and it's funny being a health researcher and everything's like negative outcomes, discrimination, barriers to care, but I think in this area, in the last now almost 8 years that I've been doing work in this area, there have been some positive developments. So in terms of research on pregnancy and birth outcomes of women with physical disabilities, there's a lot of really great research happening in the States, and there's specific funding for research in that area, which is really exciting, but Canada has been really slow. As I mentioned, many population-based surveys do not collect data around disability. So this is a big gap that we need to fill. But we also do know that things are happening in Canada. So I don't know if many people know, but just this spring at Sunnybrook, they opened what they've called the Accessible Care Pregnancy Clinic. I think that's the official name. So this is a team of healthcare providers at Sunnybrook who specifically provide care for women with physical disabilities. And this is, I think, the first clinic in North America doing this. So this is really important and really innovative, and I think there's opportunities to do this at other large hospitals in Toronto and across Ontario and Canada. There's also some positive things happening in terms of understanding provider-level barriers to care. So women with physical disabilities have identified a number of barriers to care, and in studies asking healthcare providers what are their barriers to care for providing care to this population, they have identified many of the same things. So a lack of accessible office equipment, a lack of information, education. So many of them said, you know, when I did my medical training or nursing or midwifery education, nobody talked about disability. So this is something we need to amp up, and something that healthcare providers are recognizing as a barrier. And there's been some rumblings, and I've been invited to participate in helping develop guidelines for the Society of Obstetrics and Gynecology Canada. So a long time ago, when I started my PhD, I contacted them and said, do you have any information on pregnancy and disability? And they have nothing. If you look on their website, they have nothing. And many other health bodies around maternal health in Canada have nothing, but things are starting to change. So I think the clinic at Sunnybrook is a really good step. Hopefully guidelines coming out soon. One thing we definitely need to do is infuse more disability-related education into medical, nursing, midwifery education. And I'm also, I don't want to like self-promote, but I'm really excited that this summer I'm going to be starting to work on a study in Ontario that will produce population-based data on outcomes for women with physical disabilities. Because in Canada, we don't have this information. A lot of the stats and information that I'm sharing with you come from the States because our data sets often don't look at disability or include disability as a demographic when we're looking at prenatal care or maternity care. So this is something that's going to be happening in Ontario. So we're going to be linking different administrative data sets. So I think it's the born mom baby data set and also ODSP and other data sets that track information on disability. So we'll be linking these larger data sets to get an understanding of fertility rates and pre-pregnancy characteristics of women with physical disabilities in Ontario compared to women who don't have disabilities, and also look at maternal and infant outcomes and consider what factors might exacerbate or explain risks for poor outcomes. And I just want to conclude by sharing some resources, because what came out again in my research and what I've been talking to other people is that people don't know where to look for resources, or resources aren't always consistent or always available. And I see everyone taking out their phones and taking pictures, but so in terms of clinical resources, so again, the Sunnybrook has the pregnancy clinic now for women with disabilities. Again, the Society for Obstetrics and Gynecology Canada doesn't have anything on their website, but hopefully in the next year or so, they're going to have some information on disability. But a number of years ago now, I think almost 7 or 8 years ago, the American equivalent, so the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, developed an interactive website for clinicians for serving women with disabilities broadly. So this is a good resource to check out. Now it's a little dated, but I think it's really important that it's there. In Toronto, there is a parenting with a disability network, so they provide support for parents with disabilities, specifically mostly around physical disability, but I think they're broadening to include sensory disabilities and other disabilities, so this is a good resource. In British Columbia, there is a group called the Perinatal Spinal Cord Injury Working Group, and they have developed some resources specifically around pregnancy and spinal cord injury, and you can find that online, and I think it might be linked through Spinal Cord Injury BC or the Rick Hansen Institute. Another resource, more of kind of a lay resource, but also that shares a woman's personal experience. So there's a book called Maternity Roles, and this is by a woman who is quadriplegic, and she is based in Saskatchewan, and she writes about her 2 experiences of pregnancy and labor birth, and it's a really, I think it's less than 200 pages. It's a really good read. So it was, I think, her master's thesis that she turned into a book, but it interweaves things about care experiences, disability theory, and just generally her experience of becoming a mother. And I know today I talked mostly about physical disability, and a lot of what I talked about is in my paper that's in the Disability and Health Journal. But there is work happening here in Toronto also around intellectual and developmental disabilities. So if people want to look up the work of Dr. Hilary Brown, she's at U of T Scarborough and colleagues, they've done some work around there. And then also some colleagues that I have in the United States who are doing a lot of work around disability. So a lot of the stats that I presented about outcomes come from their work. So I just want to leave that there. And then also related to some of those researchers in the States, they've developed kind of more accessible resources based on their research through the National Research Center for Parents on Disability. So there's a lot of information on the web, and not a lot of people know about it. So I just wanted to end by sharing that. And on my website, you can also find a list of these and many other resources. So thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. So we do have time we have about 5 minutes for any questions or comments. And if you do decide to provide any questions or comments. We ask that you please keep it brief, as we do have lunch outside, and I know some of you might be getting hangry, like I am, and your brain's slowly shutting off. So again, if you could keep it brief, and hopefully Leslie will be around during the lunch period to chat with you all. And also, someone may have misplaced their iPhone. You got an ab workout tomorrow about 8 to 9 a.m. So if you are that person, just let me know. Thanks. All right.
Hi.
Yeah. So there's a continuing theme here this morning of here in Canada especially, we don't have the data, and we don't seem to be asking the questions. So in the research project that you're about to launch into, I'm wondering if you will also be asking the questions of not just about birthing people and their disabilities, but the other intersections about race, about sexual identity. If those will be considered, so that we can start having this information that we need to provide appropriate and respectful care.
For sure. So as far as I know, in terms of linking the administrative data set, so I think there is some data on race and ethnicity, so I think that will be included in our analysis in terms of understanding care experiences and outcomes. And then with this project, there'll also be a qualitative component that I'm going to be leading. So I'm going to be talking to different stakeholders, so not only women with physical disabilities, but also policymakers, hopefully, and healthcare providers, to get their perspectives and to really understand why there are barriers to care, why there might be poor outcomes. So I think bringing in some of those intersections is really important, and I really wanted to do that in my dissertation. I tried so hard to get women not only kind of a range of physical disabilities, but other intersecting identities, and that was really hard. And I feel like that's so important because in the broader literature that I've been reading for almost 10 years now, a lot of the studies, especially the qualitative studies, are very homogenous in terms of their participants. So they're often white women with disabilities who are generally highly educated or higher than what is known of the population. They're married. So we don't know a lot about, for example, how women with color with disabilities experience pregnancy and birth, and also queer and trans people with disabilities experience pregnancy and birth. And actually, I forgot to mention, so there's a shot of a book here called Eliminating Equities for Women with Disabilities, and this is a book all about the health of disabilities, and it was produced by the American Psychological Association. I actually was invited to write a chapter for this book, and my chapter specifically focuses on the intersection of disability and sexual minority and gender minority populations. So that's like an intersection that we don't know a lot about, and I think, yeah, there's definitely hopefully room in this project that I'm going to be contributing to explore those intersections.
My name is Virginia Collins, and I'm here representing Perinatal Support Worker Program, and most of you don't know what it is because it's a relatively new program. However, one of the things in our curriculum is that we actually train personal support workers to work with clients with disability through pregnancy, birth, for infancy, and first year of life. One of our partners is the Center for Independent Living. We've been working with them for 4 years now. And one of the biggest issues that we have are a complete lack of resources. There's nothing mainstream available, and if you're in some ways lucky enough to have a disability that doesn't interfere with your senses, then you can access some and sort of extrapolate whether or not these would be appropriate for you. But in terms of if you're visually impaired or hearing impaired, then you have virtually no resources available to you, and you'd have to create them at great expense.
Yeah, I think your point really speaks to one of the main messages I hope to get across from my dissertation work, is that the idea of a pregnant body is really narrow. So we don't imagine women with disabilities to also be pregnant or maternal bodies, and we need to broaden that, because then we can recognize all these different gaps in services. When we recognize that people who are pregnant and parenting aren't just straight, cisgender, white, able-bodied, et cetera, we can really expand in terms of providing better services. And I think especially around disability and accessibility, this is something that should be cross-cutting the healthcare system generally, especially as our population is aging. Like, it's unacceptable that, you know, every floor doesn't have an accessible washroom. Like, that seems common sense, but that's not always considered.
Thanks again, Leslie. So we're going to break now for lunch. Lunch is located directly outside. Just a reminder as to the washrooms are located right after the sign-in desk where the random letters are. And we also want to remind you or let you know that we will be providing the PowerPoint presentations, hopefully, on our website after today's conference. And we will be providing a YouTube video of the presentation in case you may have missed the first half of the day. So we're going to have lunch now, and we're going to come back together at 1:30 p.m. 1:30. Thanks.